You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from just outside the capital of the United States of America, it is time now for the show that brings you more side of the real issues that in the independent corner. I am radio host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, and burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we make up the most disruptive show in American news, let alone, let's say world news. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, heading into the headlines here. We're going to be circling back on a few of these later with guests. Let's just get right into it. Our first headline: CIA Director Gina Haspel and National Security Agency Director Paul Nakasone are meeting with a group of congressmen known as the Gang of Eight to go over reports that Russia was paying bounties to the Taliban to kill coalition forces, which would include Americans. President Trump has said he was not informed of this possibility and that many deemed it unlikely. We actually have a clip from Donald Trump taken just yesterday. Andre, let's play that clip.
If there is ever a scenario in which Russia puts a bounty on U.S. troops, how would you respond?
First of all, they'd hear about it, but we never heard about it because intelligence never found it to be of that level where it would rise to that. When you bring something into a president, and I see many, many things, and I'm sure I don't see many things that they don't think rose to the occasion. This didn't rise to the occasion. And from what I hear, and I hear it pretty good, the intelligence people many of them didn't believe it happened at all. I think it's a hoax. I think it's a hoax by the newspapers and the Democrats.
So based on what you've been briefed, do you think it is?
I agree with the intelligence people. I think, frankly, that many of the intelligence people didn't think it was something that even happened.
Again, that is the voice of President Donald Trump. He was responding to allegations, again, that Russia had paid Taliban forces to place bounties on American soldiers, including, this would be coalition forces. This is often misreported. Anyway, we'll be talking more about that later. Our second headline today: the British and Australian governments are considering offering a path to citizenship for up to 3 million Hong Kong citizens. China has threatened Britain with countermeasures, saying that the United Kingdom had promised not to offer residency to people living in Hong Kong. This follows the passage of a controversial new law in Beijing that some would say curtails the rights of citizens in Hong Kong to free expression. The Russian constitutional reform that would reset Russian President Vladimir Putin's term limit has passed, receiving 78% of the vote. Several hundred other reforms were also passed with this vote. Putin will now be able to run for re-election in 2024 and again in 2030. The European Union has laid out new travel recommendations to be adhered to by its member states. They're opening borders effectively to 14 countries. The countries from which citizens can now travel to Europe are Algeria, Australia, Canada, Georgia, Japan, Montenegro, Morocco, New Zealand, Rwanda, Serbia, South Korea, Thailand, Tunisia, and Uruguay. Notably not on that list are the U.S. and China. The U.S. is absent due to our ongoing problems handling the spread of the novel coronavirus. China is absent due to the fact that they are currently banning travel from the European Union. After Mayor Bill de Blasio last week decided to paint Black Lives Matter in front of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, which has not yet happened, by the way. It was an order, it hasn't been put into place yet. Trump responded on Twitter. I just quote this whole thing here. New York City is cutting police funds by $1 billion, and yet the New York City mayor is going to paint a big, expensive yellow Black Lives Matter sign on Fifth Avenue, denigrating this luxury avenue. This will further antagonize New York's finest who love New York and vividly remember the horrible BLM chant, pigs in a blanket, fry 'em like bacon. Maybe our great police, who have been neutralized and scorned by a mayor who hates and disrespects them, won't let this symbol of hate be affixed to New York's greatest street. Spend this money fighting crime instead. End quote. More to talk about there later, I'm sure. In our next story, the CHAZ/CHOP, that is the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest, as it was quickly relabeled, they've been cleared out. This has been cleared out in Seattle on Mayor Jenny Durkan's orders. Police said on Twitter they had made 31 arrests. U.S. Attorney General William Barr said the message of today's action is simple but significant. The Constitution protects the right to speak and assemble freely, but it provides no right to commit violence or defy the law, end quote. In the park, people discussed racism and systemic inequality, gave speeches, painted murals, handed out snacks, and a community garden was set up. There were also 2 fatal shootings and multiple others injured as a result of those shootings in the autonomous zone/occupied protest. In our next story, emergency teams in Myanmar have found over 113 bodies buried by a landslide at a jade mine. A member of a local civic society group helping in the aftermath of the disaster said those killed were informal workers scavenging the waste left by a larger mining company. This sadly means, as a local member of a local civic organization group said, that means that they're basically do no recourse, sadly, because they were independent, because they were freelancers. There's not going to be anybody there to help them, as far as she was saying, at least. Those are the headlines. You're all caught up. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what's on your mind today? What's your top priority?
So, my top priority is 2, and honestly 3, but the last one is so bad I can't even present it on the radio. Xenophobic ads that were basically launched at one Donald Trump. Now, I don't like Trump. And I even hate having to keep saying that every time I give one of these particular conversations where a lefty has to stand up as an adult in the room and say, this is too far, this is too much, and this goes well beyond anything that should be involved in our political discourse involving countries that we are not at war with. 2 ads, one from a Republican group, one from a progressive group, hitting Trump from both sides, apparently, of the political spectrum on one issue. Now, the New York Times, powered by intelligence from anonymous intel officials, something that has been basically a fixture in the Donald Trump presidency, either from the Russiagate stuff or even leading up to this, or the Ukraine thing, or now this. This is the new thing. Trump knew that the Russians were paying Taliban bounties in order to murder Americans. Oh, explosive! Made even more so because America doesn't necessarily take into account what it does around the world, so it can look at something like that and remove everything else off the table and just focus on that one issue out of entire context. Whether this is true or not, and I don't even know if this is true, that's the catch, that's the problem. We've had too many of these stories that have basically blown up in these guys' face. But assume the worst. Assume it is true. We, the United States, was paying to do the same thing, right? When we were talking about Afghanistan. Or we were paid to do the same thing in Iran when we were involved in that coup. Or we were paying to do the same. You can go all around the world. Do you realize in Chalmers Johnson's book, Blowback, he has 2 books, Blowback and there's another one, I can't think of the name of the other one, but he makes the point that after 9/11, we had no idea who hit us. Because fact of the matter is, it could have been somebody from any part of the world that we've been involved in, making their lives miserable. Whether it was the kill squads that were in El Salvador, the undermining of the government of Iran, basically creating a coup, allowing, because they wanted to get more part of their oil. I mean, you can go into South America where you get into Honduras and the wars that took place then with us using proxies in order to effect our will. Even the paramilitary groups that were left in areas of Europe. They were basically setting bombs off in order to blame leftist governments to keep those governments away from having any kind of policy that moved to the left. Are you kidding me? I'm just shocked. Actually, I'm not shocked. But it's disturbing that this level of context gets dropped off the table. We have been involved in coups all over the world. Even the most recent one where we tried to take down Syria and ended up with 500,000 lives lost. The money that we were giving to the terrorists, the billions of dollars, is that used to kill Syrians? What about the money that we spent in Libya? Was that used to kill Libyans? Or Pompeo joking about killing Russians? I guess I'm making the point that do we really have standing to make this argument? And are you really going to make this argument in the face of a world that knows your crimes and knows your sins, even if the people of your country don't? There have been 2 groups that have been hitting Trump on this very specific issue. Vote That, lefty group, Lincoln Project, Republican super PAC. Let's hear Lincoln Project first. Go after Donald Trump. I found this ad to be so disturbing, and there's one more with Lincoln ad that is even worse. But let's hear this one first.
In the last year, flag-draped coffins have returned from Afghanistan. Now we know Vladimir Putin pays a bounty for the murder of American soldiers. Donald Trump knows too, and does nothing. Putin pays the Taliban cash to slaughter our men and women in uniform. And Trump is silent, weak, controlled. Instead of condemnation, he insists Russia be treated as our equal. Instead of retaliation, he invites Putin to America. When Trump tells you he stands by the troops, he's right. Just not our troops.
The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Just not our troops. He stands by who? Who troops is he standing by? Russians? Syrians? I mean, because he was out there killing them. Who troops is he standing by? I find this video to be so disturbing. I mean, they're basically calling the President of the United States a traitor. A typical refrain. And while it pains me to even point out that despite the fact that they're pointing out to the president and calling him a traitor, because Trump has done similar things to either to Ilhan Omar or someone else, I guess it bothers me greatly that this is the level of discourse in our politics, where we are basically attacking another country for doing the exact same thing that we've done for the last 100 years. Let's hear Vote Vet. This is the lefty group. Let's hear them go at it.
He shakes his hand. An American dies. They pal around. Another roadside attack. Putin pays bounties to Taliban enemies to kill American soldiers. And not a word from Donald Trump. Intelligence reports on his desk. He says nothing to his Russian master. Takes no action to protect us. Who is the enemy? If you're going to act like a traitor, you don't get to thank us for our service.
Wow. If you're gonna act like a traitor, you don't get to thank us for our service. I mean, terms like traitor, he's letting American troops die, and he shakes the hand of his master, Vladimir Putin. Now, I do understand that I am on a Russian network, so don't misunderstand me. And I also get that anything that I say on this point will get castigated as just being a product of that particular government. Look, I've had a channel 3 years before I ever got here, and my point of view on this stuff has been pretty much the same. I don't like this notion of us browbeating and attacking other countries and instigating what can be a larger conflict with a nuclear nation, all for domestic political reasons, which is basically Russiagate used to hide and obfuscate the fact that they cheated Sanders, not to mention obfuscate the fact that Clinton failed miserably to reality show hosts. But being willing to go at odds with another country like this and sandbag Donald Trump in the process of trying to get any level of peace deal or any level of cooperation with the Russian government. Shane, these ads got really bad. I mean, one was saying, I want to stump, or we should be stumping the S out of Russians. Like, even one making the point that when they kill one of our soldiers, it's a murder. I suppose when we kill one of theirs, it's a killing. Or it's, accidental or incidental killings, or whatever they call it. I guess I'm saying this is problematic to look at the world from the standpoint that you do something in the world, nobody says anything, you say mum. Somebody else does the exact same thing, and you throw a fit. Now, I don't even know if they were doing this. That's the sad part, because of the level of media and their influence and intelligence. What do you think about this? These videos have gotten bad. Do you agree? Disagree?
They've gotten horrible. Yeah, this is another case where we just agree flat out. Yeah, they've gotten horrible in a few directions. For one thing, like you're saying, they're continuing this trend of relying on completely unsourced, unverified evidence. And that's not good. There's this larger conversation we can have on the other side of the break about privacy and transparency and how you can play sort of arbitrage games by selectively using privacy and transparency to either generate fake messages or to reveal truth, but in a sort of selective way that just punishes certain people. There are a couple things, though, that we can talk about on this. I want to come back, keep this conversation going. We're also taking calls in this next segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Regardless, though, We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening now to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Lines.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a regular segment called Criminal Injustice about the most egregious conduct of our courts and how justice is denied to so many people in this country. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Thursday and every Thursday for thorough and independent analysis of our criminal injustice system.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. Welcome back to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. If you're in the D.C. area, you can listen to us on the radio at 105.5 FM. If you're in Kansas City, also in D.C., 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, you can listen to us 102.9 FM and 104.7. You can also check us out all over the place online on Spreaker, Stitcher, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Periscope. Also, when you're on those platforms, please, if you're picking up what we're putting down, if you like what we're saying, or even if you don't like it, but you want to, diss us, feel free to share our work and or like or dislike it. But let's get back into this conversation. We're also taking calls 202-521-1320 if you want to join in. So I left off, I was talking about privacy and transparency. That was this sort of oblique side of things where we're coming at it from this weird angle. But it's true. If you look at it, one side of this information age that we're living in is like what information is successfully spreading and what information is successfully being hid. And that is effectively like if you're trying to control the levers of information, if you're trying to prevent certain people from saying things or boost certain messages, all you're doing in this almost mechanical sense is you're playing with what beliefs people are supposed to share. You're sort of opening and closing gates of communication in order to boost certain messages and suppress others. And that very power is itself dangerous. It's itself debilitating to the public's ability to have honest conversation about things. So that's sort of point one. Point two, these attack ads, coming back to the actual ads, the Lincoln Project ad, the Vote Vets ad, attack ads in the context of a political campaign are completely reasonable. They happen all the time, and I don't really care about them. In other words, I would prefer to have more positive messaging, but I also just understand you're going to have to sling some mud, if there's mud to be slung. But what's worrying to me is the bellicosity, is that, again, two world superpowers, large stockpiles of nuclear weapons, a history of a century of aggression, almost a century, and then we get this. And what really worries me is that you think that the people in positions of power who are funding these ads have some sense of, I don't know, just even personal security, let alone like social security or a respect for, the stability and welfare of the American people, let alone the world population, the Russian people. They don't seem to. This is just pushing for war, and that's what's disgusting. Tens or hundreds of millions of lives could be lost if we got into another world war, and it seems like they're increasing the likelihood of that war just to get this president taken out. That's evil. I don't know how else to say it. That is about the definition of evil. Those are my thoughts there.
Brinksmanship. Yeah, it's a level of brinksmanship that's mind-blowing. It's almost as if they believe that a war couldn't take place or that a larger conflict couldn't erupt over this. I mean, when Democrats went after Trump, and Trump basically came into office saying, I want to have less war. He didn't necessarily come in as a peacenik, but believe it or not, oddly enough, if Clinton won this that election, do you believe that she would have tried to pull out of Syria? No, she wouldn't have. Would she have gone further in Venezuela? Maybe not. I mean, I don't necessarily know what her intentions were in Venezuela, but would she have gotten more invested in the Middle East? Yes. It wouldn't shock me in the least. And so there's this kind of odd thing that when Trump got into office, between the two candidates, he was the one that was least likely to start a war. And despite all of the bellicosity that he's had with North Korea and Iran and for that matter, Venezuela, I mean, the honest truth is he may have killed people with those sanctions. Yes. And we attack him for it constantly and pretty derisively for it. By the same token, if this was a Democrat, they would have been further in. I just don't believe that this would have ended up without us getting further involved into a war, because I can look at what Obama did. I mean, Obama was very invested in those wars, whether it was in Yemen, whether it was in Yemen, Syria, Libya, all of these countries. Libya, people give that a pass almost, as if that's like a footnote. That's not a footnote. You have a lot of people that died in that war. They're selling slaves in that country now as a result of Obama and Clinton's actions. So now I agree with you, man. And one more point that you made. Selective justice is not justice. Like if you are looking at something and you are raising something that somebody did while ignoring something that everybody else is doing, then you're basically isolating this person for some kind of justice that need to be meted out, that for whatever reason doesn't need to be meted out to everybody else. I thought that way when they went after Trump for the impeachment thing, saying that he was withholding weapons or something from the Ukraine, and then Joe Biden basically said, yeah, I withheld the money until I got fired. I mean, they want to pass the other one. They have all sorts of feelings about. We have a caller, actually, Michael from Sydney. Michael, what's going on?
Yeah, hi guys. You know, like I'm with you. You know, I'm a supporter of Trump, and I'm a lefty. You know, but I mean, like at the end of the day, you could run an ad. Basically, Trump could run an ad saying, you know, Barack Obama sent our troops to die in Syria. He's a traitor to the working class of Americans. He stands by as and shakes the hand of his corporate masters as American troops in Syria are slaughtered. You could run an ad similar to that, you know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, everyone knows America is run by corporations. And, I mean, this is coming from a country that has a $25 million bounty on the president of Venezuela. I mean...
Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? I forgot about that. Isn't that crazy? We're saying that we were putting that they were putting bounties on our troops, and we have a bounty on the president of Venezuela. That's amazing. Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
You know, I mean, like, yeah, no, I mean, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, you know, every American leader has betrayed the working class by sending poor people off around the world to kill other poor people in poor countries, right? That's a betrayal of the working class, you know? And they're all taking the hands of their corporate masters. You know, I mean, Venezuela is all about the Koch brothers. They own two heavy oil refineries down there in the Gulf of Mexico. And Venezuela is the largest supplier of heavy crude in the world. You know, so, I mean, the Koch brothers are heavily involved in Venezuela. You know, like the military-industrial complex is involved all over the world, all through America, killing and slaughtering people and sending poor Americans to die. Right? Let's not beat around the bush. It's not rich Americans who go to war. I mean, they've all got bone spurs, or you know, they get out of the Vietnam War, or they, you know, I mean, they all, none of them go to war to die. You know what I mean? You know, like, you know, it feeds the rich while it buries the poor. You know, that's what it's really about. You know, so yeah, I mean, that old song, you ain't me, I'm no senator's son, I ain't no fortunate one. You know. I mean, at the end of the day, it's poor Americans who join the military to get health care, education after they get out, and because they got no other way out of poverty, they join the military. They got ruthless people out there at schools, you know, telling teenagers to come join the military, glorifying war, showing in promotional videos, and they're selling out the working class of America, all of them. And on the issue of Donald Trump and Joe Biden, I don't like Trump, but Trump hasn't got, you know, America in any wars, okay? And at the end of the day, you can have a fascist who at least keeps you out of war, or you can have an incompetent, senile old fool who will be a mouthpiece of the deep state because all they can do is read from a teleprompter.
Thank you, Michael. He has a point. I mean, that's a really good point. So you have people who get into the military because some of them are patriotic, so I don't want to take that away. But you have some who do get into the military because they just want to feed their family. And that's not just here in the United States. It's also abroad. I've met people in Kenya who had friends that joined the U.S. military in Kenya, in Africa, to fight in some of these foreign wars. So, Shane, I mean, he's right? I mean, it is the poor Americans that go and die. The rich are not going, you know, Trump and his bone spurs is not going for some war zone to fight.
That's always been that way. Yeah, and it's egregious. I mean, as far as I can tell, legitimately, that's the history of wars. You have elites who send non-elites to go and kill other non-elites for other elites. That, you know, just frankly, as far as I can tell, there are no exceptions to that. What frustrates me, I was about 10 years old at the time. I remember in 2002, there were protests against the Iraq War, and I was in a couple of those protests with my parents. I wasn't that woke. You know, they brought me out, and I thought, okay, this is good. Let's go do this. But what I remember, and again, I'm kind of young, but what I remember vaguely was that most of the people protesting, as far as I can tell, were Democrats. You know, you saw some libertarians here and there. There were definitely some Republicans, but there's a big Democratic push. I thought growing up that the Democrats were the anti-war party. Turns out I'm wrong. And that's like, there's this topsy-turvy, kaleidoscopic, upside-down nature of modern reality where there is no coherent ideology on either side. If both wings of the bird are flapping, it's hard to tell hard to tell the difference. I don't know. You get my point there.
I do get your point.
They're
That's kind of why I say it's always relative. It's not like there's nothing objective to what that makes a party in this case, and at least here, it's all relative to what the other party is.
That's the damn frustrating thing. Yeah, we need, in a weird way, like if party politics were a genuine conversation between two oppositional views, I threw the word genuine in there just to fruit things up to make things sound a little bit nicer. But if there were a conversation between two opposing views, at least ideally, there'd be a lot of conflict, but you'd get like that genuine conversation. But there doesn't seem to be. It seems like it's all on these sort of more or less marginal issues that don't have anything to do with fundamental economic or political conversations that you'd need to deal with to try to save our country. And I don't know what to do about that. I don't see anybody else who really knows what to do about it. John Wood Jr., I'll just give a brief shout out to him, the Braver Angels org. That seems like that could have some impact. And I'm kind of into that idea of trying to bring people together for local conversations, trying to have these like across the divide local conversations. And then ideally you can, get some wisdom from the nuance that's expressed in those local conversations. And you can bring that wisdom up to the Congress, up to the federal government in some way. But that's complicated. Let's go to EJ in Florida. EJ, you're on the line. What is on your mind?
EJ. Kind of comment about that two-wing same bird. Can you hear me?
Yeah, could you please start over? The first couple seconds got clipped off.
Oh, I was just saying, Shane and Jamarl, I appreciate what you both do. I just wanted to comment about the two wings of the same bird comment. You're just talking about our adversarial system that's supposed to bring out the best of all of our ideals. It's fine that those two wings are floating a single bird in one direction, right? But in this particular instance, that bird is supposed to represent the interests of the people and not the government. That adversarial system has been utilized to divide people so that the government can do what they want and acquisition power for themselves, which is a big deal. Now, I just wanted to share something that I thought Jamarl would find pretty funny. I think everyone would. The U.S. House unanimously passed China's sanctions bill over controversial Hong Kong law. What's funny about this is the wording. The U.S. House of Representatives on Wednesday passed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act by unanimous consent to penalize banks who do business with Chinese officials responsible for cracking down on pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. The bill, which is similar but not identical to a measure passed by the U.S. Senate last week, will require Senate approval again before going to President Donald Trump for the signature. A day earlier, Hong Kong police arrested hundreds and used pepper spray and water cannons to disperse protesters in the city. And it's just hilarious that, this is something that they're utilizing to justify this, like they don't live in the United States where the president is tear gassing people to take photos. I just wanted to share that. And you guys are doing excellent work. Please keep it up because people need to hear this.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, that is pretty wild. I mean, what's taking place in Hong Kong? But I don't live in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is so weird to me in regards to how it's put together and the mechanics or the politics of it. Because some of this and what people are seeing is economic distress. And yet the only way that the U.S. media talks about it is from the standpoint of pro-democracy, knife-wielding, protesters. There's a nuance in that conversation. And I got to be honest, I don't entirely know what's right or wrong in that because it's complicated. It's like you have Britain take a place, hold that place for a period of time. Britain gives it back to China. And now Britain doesn't entirely get out of the politics of that place. And China, who rightfully and has that as a sore spot, tell them to kick rocks. This is our country. And you have they're supposed to merge back in 50 years or so. Well, if they're supposed to merge back in 50 years, what are the mechanics of the merging back? It's certainly something is going to have to take place in order to make that merger. And this seems to only get worse. Shane?
Yeah, no, there's a lot more to talk about with this stuff. It's also complicated. My very brief perspective is it's not our business, and I think we're too tired of making things our business. But from my perspective, if I were a citizen in Hong Kong, I'd probably if I had the values I currently do as an American, I wouldn't like what's going on, and I would want to be able to leave. And I just hope that for the people in that region that there is some sort of escape valve so that the people who want to get out can get out, the people who want to stay locally can stay locally. Then again, I understand China is worried about a bunch of people going out of the country, becoming dissidents abroad, and having that be a sort of long-term whiplash effect. It's complicated, but I'm gonna close it there. We're going into another great conversation, this time with Ford Fisher. We'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back again. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A quick update, not exactly an update, but a sort of redirection. If you want to hear more about the conversation we were just having about Hong Kong and China, we're going to be having a longer conversation about that with Danny Haifong in an hour at 8:30 Eastern. So just check back in if that's something that piqued your interest, and we'll get back to it then. Regardless, though, right now we're very happy to be joined by Ford Fisher. Ford Fisher is an independent journalist, videographer, editor, computer scientist, and web designer. His work has been featured on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, and more. Ford, very happy to have you with us. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, doing great. It's been an interesting couple of weeks. I mostly cover activism stuff, which had dropped off during COVID until really, I guess I should say, the last month or so.
That's what I've heard. Yeah, we've been talking about that whole transition. I also, real quick, want to check. I know that you've been sort of switching different career opportunities. Where are you right now? Where should we be pointing people if they want to see your work?
Yeah, so right now I am working back at News2Share. It's news2share.com, and I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And basically, to those who don't know, what I do is do live stream and raw footage of of activism.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, we'd had conversations. I didn't know exactly where you were. Wanted to make sure people got that info. And on that point, if you want to, you can check out News2Share on Twitter, N2S Reports, and the number 2S Reports, the word reports. You can also follow Ford Fisher on Twitter at Ford Fisher, Fischer. Regardless, though,
right, yeah.
Where have you been? So we brought you on to talk about the Black House Autonomous Zone, but I'm curious, what sort of tour have you been doing? Which protests have you been visiting,
yeah.
And what have they been like for you?
Right. So I have been hiring people outside of Washington, D.C. and outside of where I can travel as well. So one of the interesting things that I actually had video of was that I hired somebody film inside of the CHAZ/CHOP zone of Seattle before yesterday. Police kind of took that down. To people who don't know, this was kind of a so-called autonomous zone in the city of Seattle that was sort of erected by protesters who decided to just occupy the space. What was interesting is that there was such a stark contrast between kind of how politicians saw it and kind of what video showed during the day. And it sounded like there was a real difference between the way it operated during the day, which was very much an Occupy Wall Street sort of vibe, positive, a lot of like free speech space and art things going on. But it sounded like there was some level of dysfunction at nighttime, which led to several shootings, which seemed to be the impetus to kind of shut it down. I think for me, probably the most interesting trip that I've had actually of late is that I did go to Tulsa, where Trump had his first post-COVID rally. And that was shockingly few numbers of people compared to what had been expected. Granted, 6,000 people showing up to anything is still a lot, as well as thousands of people counter-demonstrating and a huge sort of police presence. But in the end, Trump had believed that he was going to have, a stadium packed, and he ended up with a stadium only a third full. But it was still very interesting to see the way that Trump supporters had come out for him, some of them camping as many as 3 days ahead of the event to get a good spot, which wasn't exactly necessary because they could have waltzed in 10 minutes before the event. And then since then, upon returning to Washington, D.C., I have spent some time in the CHAZ, which is kind of the area, like you said, that was inspired by the CHAZ here in Washington, D.C., although its level of autonomy was starkly different than Seattle's.
What do you mean by that? The level of autonomy was starkly different than the one in Seattle.
So in Seattle, it seems like although Seattle's mayor and sort of police would disagree with this, they basically had established an area that was functionally free of police. There was a precinct contained geographically in Seattle's area that was abandoned, and so police generally weren't actually able to get into the CHAZ. And on the occasions that there were shootings, for example, police really didn't have the ability to access the crime scene witnesses and so forth, and so arrests weren't really made. In the case of the White House, the area outside the White House that protesters had taken and declared to be a Black House autonomous zone was what they were calling it. Police were never actually forcibly kept out of the area. When police wanted to move in, they've been able to.
I see.
And indeed, they've placed in a special focus around St. John's Church, which is inside the CHAZ, where there's a line of police that have been around it basically 24/7.
Let me ask you this. For the several blocks, the autonomous zone, I was fascinated by the CHAZ thing. The right wing has basically castigated it as, the end of America happening in Seattle. Trump has called it this kind of lawless region full of criminals. But the reality of it is, CHAZ wasn't. What was the thing that undid it? I mean, this was several blocks that was taken over basically with, I guess, the heart of it being a police station that they had just didn't take back from the protesters. And the protesters was having this much. How many people were part of the CHAZ? And how many blocks was taken? And what was it like on the inside of it?
Yeah. So again, I didn't personally go there. I hired somebody who filmed inside the CHAZ for me. But from what I saw, my understanding is that there were probably in the low numbers of thousands of people who were there specifically, to participate in the activities of the CHAZ. But I think what's interesting is that, it included apartment buildings, right? It included places that people live who were essentially bystanders to the situation, same with businesses. And so I've kind of heard to the extent that I've talked to people online or talked to people who have met them, I've heard kind of mixed reviews on whether that's been good for people who lived inside the CHAZ, but essentially not voluntarily, right? So in some cases, for example, I've heard of business owners that are actually quite happy because their business had been doing poorly during COVID, and now there's a bunch of people who are patronizing their business. So that can be a positive for some of them. Whereas for others, I've heard that, for example, just people living in apartment buildings within the CHAZ, that when they've tried to kind of go in and out of their home, that they found it disruptive, and that activists, for example, have asked them to check their ID in order to verify that they actually live there, which, needless to say, is not something that would be happening under the normal jurisdiction of the police.
Wow.
That's very interesting.
Disturbing.
Yeah. Could you also, something, I've been watching this and I've been very curious about the CHAZ and the CHOP thing for a while. I actually attended some Occupy protests back in the day. A bunch of weird stories there, a bunch of stuff that went down. But regardless, I have memories, and kind of fond memories in some cases. It was very chaotic, and there was, specifically in New York, in the New York Occupy protest, there were like rapes and things going on. And so there were is this duality? And that's kind of what you were saying. And so I wanted to get back to this idea. You were saying that during the days there was one environment, during the nights there was another. Can you tell us a bit more? I know, again, you weren't there, but what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so I've seen that pretty universally footage of what has gone on during the day, including what I received, is pretty absent any kind of violence. There's not particularly conflict that was happening during the day, but at nighttime there would be a lot of tweets, videos, and so forth of different issues that would happen. Some of which didn't even necessarily lead to some kind of extreme outcome such as death. But, you know, in one case that I had read about, for example, one participant had accused another person of stealing, like a laptop or something. And, you know, basically CHAZ has its own kind of ipso facto, or had its own sort of like ipso facto law enforcement, right? So that would end up with the members of the community basically going through somebody else's stuff, searching through things, sometimes leading to fights and things like that. So it sounded like they didn't have, you know, and bear in mind, they only existed for 3 weeks. So, but it sounds like during that time, there wasn't much of a conflict resolution system in place that would peacefully sort of solve those problems. I think it might have been an interesting experiment to know, you know, if they had been allowed to continue for like a year instead of a month, would they have been able to adapt to those problems? Essentially, they were trying to establish kind of an anarchist space. Anarchists often talk about, oh, we have, you know, this or that solution of how we would deal with these kinds of problems without a state. 3 weeks probably isn't enough time to figure out a replacement for everything that the apparatus of the state does. So, you know, I would have been fascinated to see what could have come out of that if it had lasted longer.
Very good point. I agree with you. And, you know, the anarchists, I would imagine that their argument is basically you have the equipment that you need to produce the supplies and things like that you need. People have what they need. But this is a different situation. I mean, this is basically people who've appropriated somebody else's living space. I have to be honest, I would be bothered by that myself. I mean, if all of a sudden my area was taken over by a group of people who I know nothing about and is trying now to kind of lay down a different set of organization, set of going about our affairs, even checking me as I walk into my house, that will have very serious, I would have very serious qualms with that. What of the people there? Have you heard anything about the responses of the people there from the standpoint of petitioning their government to say, hey, we don't like this. How have you abandoned us in this situation? Because like you said, not everybody agreed with this notion of this kind of takeover of that particular area. And there were apartment buildings and businesses of people who live there.
Right. So my understanding is there was actually a lawsuit that some businesses had filed against the city for allowing it to happen. I think that the issue is that the Seattle mayor largely did not want to admit the legitimacy of it actually being an autonomous zone. So they did do sort of a photo op in which some police officers walked to the police precinct and then left, sort of proving, oh, look, police can enter the CHAZ. But, you know, it's functionally not like they were actually policing it. The fact that 2 cops were able to walk in and out without, you know, dying doesn't mean that that it was actually a policed area. So there was sort of that disconnect where it seemed like the mayor didn't really want to act. However, it seems like there was kind of a last straw with a second homicide, and I think it was the third shooting that had happened the other night, which seemed to lead to them kind of coming in and knocking everything down and making several arrests. Although I'm not sure if this was part of the government's decision to basically raise the CHAZ, on Saturday, on July 4th, there actually will be an event that had sort of gone viral on conservative Facebook for a while, called Patriots Retake the CHAZ. Supposedly it will still happen, but Facebook had banned the event and many of the organizers. But basically this event had been advocating that a coalition of right-wing organizations and people show up in Seattle and, in their words, retake or liberate the CHAZ. In the event's actual description, it had claimed this will be a peaceful event. We're not advocating violence. We want to just go in and clean up graffiti and so forth. But I think everybody knows what that would have looked like if people had done that while the CHAZ was still up. So it'll be interesting to see whether that leads to, you know, a protest / counter protest or any kind of conflict. You know, between two sides. The fact that the CHAZ is gone doesn't mean that the activists have just sort of disappeared into thin air. So we'll see what that ends up looking like. But I did hire somebody to film whatever goes on there as well.
That is the voice of Ford Fisher. We'll be back with him in just a minute. We're talking about the CHAZ. We're also going to talk about the Tulsa Trump rally, and we're going to talk about the BHAZ. I've been pronouncing it BAZ. The BHAZ, the Black House Autonomous Zone, right out in front of the White House. Regardless, though, we are joined by Ford Fischer. We'll be back with him in just a second. He's an independent journalist, videographer, editor. Also, you can find his work at news2share.com, news2share.com. We'll be back with him in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we are back again. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're speaking now with Ford Fischer. Ford is an independent journalist, videographer, editor, computer scientist, and a web designer. You can find his work in CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, and more. Big platforms there. You can also follow him on Twitter at N2S Reports, and the number 2S Reports, and Ford Fischer, Ford Fischer. Regardless, though, happy to be joined by him. So, Ford, we were talking about the CHAZ. I actually don't know if we should the zone formerly known as CHAZ. I'm not sure. It's defunct at this point, as far as I can tell. But regardless, we were talking about that. You also mentioned that you went to the Tulsa rally. That you were able to get out there despite the lockdown stuff, despite coronavirus. And like you said, it was empty. It was like 1/3 capacity. Now, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like the day after all of these results came in, that it was a completely empty rally. Not completely. It was very empty compared to what people were expecting. She said that like Zoomers, like very young people, and K-pop fans had gone to TikTok and basically flooded the event with false requests for tickets. I also remember at the time, though, I believe it was Brad Parscale, Trump's campaign manager, he was saying that protesters were blocking the entrances to the event, like the metal detectors, basically keeping people from getting in. So there was like this muddle of explanations. But because you were there, we can actually ask you, did you see any of that stuff? Was there anything like that going on?
Sure. So I think, to be honest, I think that neither of those things contributed to the actual size of or the number of people that showed up in the rally itself. So first, on AOC's points, the thing about Trump rallies is that basically everybody can sign up and register. There's no fee for a ticket, and getting a ticket is not actually getting a reserved seat. It's just getting your name onto a list, which allows you to sort of walk through the door and be online to get in. So that in no way means that somebody is actually entitled to a spot for that reason. So, yeah, 1 million people registered, and it's unclear how many of those registrations were fake. But at the end of the day, a fake registration doesn't take a real spot from anybody else. So you could have 10 billion registrations, but at the end of the day, the only question is how many Trump supporters wanted to show up and enter the venue, and that's how many people you have in the venue. So on AOC's point, I am aware that those pranks happened, but I don't think that it made any kind of difference. On the point about entrances being blocked, it is true that there were leftist protesters who were kind of around the entire event. There were a few entrants. There were 3 different places you could enter through. Kind of one main entrance on the east, another on the south, and another on the west. People had mostly been lining up over the few days toward the east entrance, so I would say that was kind of the biggest or the most prominent one. Brad Parscale made a big deal out of the fact that there was one incident in which some activists with refused fascism and some Black Lives Matter protesters had basically gone up to the east entrance, and they kind of demanded to be let in. And of course, the police were saying, no, because you're not actual attendees. And so the police briefly blocked off that east entrance. After doing so, officers with less lethal shotguns, basically, came out and pushed the entire crowd back about 100 feet from that spot, and then held a line and allowed people who claimed to be rally attendees to go by them, and then they would be checked by the campaign and go through the normal metal detector line and everything else. So basically, it took them about a half hour to clear the area and then allow people through. I would say this was a small disruption, but no individual person would have been delayed more than a half hour getting in. And ultimately, there really wasn't a line. People were being processed and getting in faster than people were showing up. So there wasn't actually a disruption that would have actually caused people to not go. So I suppose it's technically possible that maybe a Trump supporter shows up during that brief half hour and then just decides, I don't feel like getting online. That Trump person might exist. On the whole, I again don't think that made any difference. The brief blockage of one entrance probably could not have changed the crowd size.
Let me ask you this. Do you believe... Oh, go ahead, Shane.
No, Jamarl, it's your turn. Go.
Okay, well, I was going to ask, Donald Trump has to know that he's having difficulties in this race. And some of the recent reporting shows that Donald Trump basically internally knows he's losing. Donald Trump knows he's losing because everything is on fire, and he seemed to not have any answers for it. I'm curious, do you think that, even if he's aware of that, do you think he has any propensity or power to do anything about it based on his own ideological framing? And for that matter, incompetence is hard to, presidenting is hard to do when you're incompetent. So from the COVID-19 thing, for the Black Lives Matter thing, for the eviction apocalypse thing, all of these things are crisis. Either one of them would have been a crisis for a president, and you have all three happening at once. Is there any cognizance that you're aware of him being able to kind of work his way out of this through any kind of policy idea that Donald Trump may have?
Yeah, I feel like the thing that I've mostly heard on these points is to try to defer toward state-level leadership. So it seems like it seems like red states tend to be less affected by COVID, which I think is more based on population numbers than anything about policy. But so I have seen Trump kind of defer to that. Oh, look at the governors. The governors are in charge of this. And if he's able to effectively make that argument, then he gets to say, look, the red states are doing better than the blue states, and he can kind of spin that as a win for him. But I personally, I don't consider my sort of job to analyze whether he is doing a good or a bad job, or he should be doing this or that. So I don't want to go sort of too deeply into that. But I will say, talking to Trump supporters generally, that when I've asked Trump supporters about COVID, what their concerns about it, how seriously they take it, and so forth, the responses tend to be mixed from that it's not actually bad in some way, that it's not such a severe issue, or that if it's a severe issue, that they don't actually blame Trump for it. So I do think that it's important to realize, and of course there are people more at the margins, and so when I go out to film people who would show up at a Trump rally, those people are much more hardcore Trump supporters than maybe somebody kind of down the middle who ended up voting for Trump. But among those hardcore Trump supporters, among the base, I have met very few people who have sort of supported Trump in the past and then stopped supporting him over these issues. That does not seem to be an extremely large political demographic. So it'll be interesting to see what happens during the election, whether there are swing voters who sort of swing back to Joe Biden, so to speak. But from what I have seen so far, I don't feel like that's an especially large demographic.
That fits. Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like a lot of people, again, part of the problem with the COVID response in America is that our response has been so politicized. And so you have people on the right who sort of just vociferously reject everything that Fauci's saying. I don't like Fauci particularly. We've been talking about that on the show. But, he's a medical authority. And the coronavirus is real. And so it's led to this dismissal of the sort of reality of the coronavirus potential. Again, up to over 130,000 deaths in America. If I'm remembering correctly at this point, we've now passed the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Vietnam War, in terms of American casualties combined. So in terms of a sort of public health crisis, again, there are larger costs to war than just the number of people who've died. But we do have this thing going on at home, and it's frustrating to see it get politicized. That's a tangent, though. I want to come back to the protests, specifically to the Black House Autonomous Zone, which, if I'm remembering correctly, was formed basically last Monday, a little bit about a week and a half ago at this point. So it's relatively new, especially compared to CHOP/CHAZ, the Seattle one. What's the atmosphere down there?
Right.
What's it like at this point?
Yeah, so I think the thing to understand about the BHAZ is that the area had been a sort of epicenter of protest for about a month. So a month ago, when riots started in the wake of the death of George Floyd, there had been some pretty intense sort of fighting in front of the White House, which included that the bathroom in the in Lafayette Park had been set on fire. Some buildings had been destroyed. Some looting occurred. That sort of thing happened, and so the police had erected sort of an 8-foot tall fence around Lafayette Park. So the closest area to the White House was what became known as Black Lives Matter Plaza. So what was kind of interesting is that Muriel Bowser had, our DC's mayor, Muriel Bowser, had painted the words Black Lives Matter in huge lettering across H Street in front of the White House. But the actual Black Lives Matter of DC organization had basically said, we think that this is just placating us. This is not, you can't simultaneously say Black Lives Matter and then call for an increase in police funding, which she had. So protests kind of continued in that space. Eventually the fence was taken down. I think that the police believed that they sort of had a return to normal. But then protests re-escalated, that police had tried to sort of clear out the area. Things re-escalated. The fence was re-erected, and then the people who stayed established what they called the BHAZ. This had actually, I think, been just sort of a result of people had actually spray painted the letters BHAZ onto St. John's Church, which ended up quickly being painted over, but that was the lettering that was used and kind of the name that some people had formed for it. Like I said, though, earlier in the last segment, I think that effectively it certainly was not a police-free zone. So it certainly didn't have the same level of autonomy or the level of being an autonomous zone as, say, Seattle. With that said, I think that, first of all, that it's certainly a lot smaller than the Seattle one. And it certainly didn't have the kind of conflict that Seattle seemed to have at night. There's nothing like homicides. I've seen much less fighting, or certainly less infighting. However, what I have seen, that has been kind of interesting, is that police have tended to move in at night and make arrests or push things away. So 5 nights ago now, there was a situation that basically at like 2 or 3 a.m., the police kind of moved in and pushed away all the tents, including medical tents, sort of breaking things and making people leave ahead of DPW arriving to clean the streets. So I actually went out a couple nights ago and myself staying out pretty late. And what was interesting was that I arrived around 12:30 in the morning. And pretty soon after that, but before I had unpacked my camera equipment, police moved in to arrest a woman who was handing out water bottles. This woman had actually just handed me a water bottle, and about a minute later, police jumped over a barricade and arrested her. And so I hadn't gotten out my camera equipment yet, so I actually managed to film this on my phone. But police basically hopped the fence, arrested her, and basically like pulled her away in the middle of the night. And however, for the rest of the night, once I had set up all my stuff, pretty much nothing happened, right? So there were people kind of hanging out. So I would say several dozen people hanging out all
That's interesting.
Through the night.
Forward, I'm sad we have to cut this off here, though. We'd love to get you back on soon. Forward Fisher, you've been listening to. He's an independent journalist, videographer, editor, and a computer scientist, also a web designer. His work has been featured on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, and more. He's the founder of News to Share Reports. You can find that News to Share, the number 2, news2share.com. Also N2S Reports on Twitter. You can also follow him on Twitter, Forward Fisher, Fischer. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We have 2 more great hours coming up. We'll be back in just a minute on the other side of this break. Again, Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be back in a minute.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a cancered political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am the meek, reclusive radio host, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to some headlines. In the news, CIA Director Gina Haspel and National Security Agency Director Paul Nakasone are meeting with a group of congressmen known as the Gang of Eight to go over reports that Russia was paying bounties to the Taliban to kill coalition forces, which would include Americans. President Trump has said that he was not informed of this possibility and that many deemed it unlikely. Let's play the clip. Okay, the British and American governments are considering. Here we are.
I got not clipped.
Oh, okay. The British and American Australian governments are considering offering a path to citizenship for up to 3 million Hong Kong citizens. China has threatened Britain with countermeasures, saying that the United Kingdom has promised not to offer residency to people living in Hong Kong. The Russian constitutional reform that would reset Russian President Vladimir Putin's term limit has passed, receiving 78% of the vote. Several hundred other reforms were also passed with this vote. Putin would now be able to run for election in 2024 and 2030. The European Union has laid out new travel recommendations to be adhered to by its member states, opening the borders of 14 countries. The countries from which citizens can now travel to Europe are Algeria, Australia, Canada, Georgia, Japan, Montenegro, Morocco, New Zealand, Rwanda, Serbia, South Korea, Thailand, Tunisia, Uruguay. Notably not on that list is the United States and China. Now, the United States is absent due to the ongoing problems with handling the spread of the coronavirus. China is absent due to the fact that they are currently banning travel from the European Union. Interesting. After Mayor de Blasio last week decided to paint Black Lives Matter in front of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, Trump responded on Twitter, "New York City is cutting police money by $1 billion, and yet the New York City mayor is going to paint big, expensive yellow Black Lives Matter sign on Fifth Avenue, denigrating the luxury avenue. This will further antagonize New York's finest, who love New York and vividly remember the horrible Black Lives Matter chant. Pigs in a blanket, fry 'em like bacon." Maybe our great police, who have been neutralized and scorned by a mayor who hates and disrespects them, won't let this symbol of hate be affixed to New York's greatest street. Spend this money fighting crime instead. Hyperbolic and unhinged as always. The CHAZ chop has been cleared in Seattle on Mayor Jenny Durkin's orders. Now, police said on Twitter that they made 31 arrests. U.S. Attorney General William Barr said the message of today's action is simple but significant. The Constitution protects the right to speak and assemble freely, but it provides no right to commit violence or defy the law. In the park, discussed racism and systemic inequality, gave speeches and painted murals, handed out snacks. A community garden was set up at the park in the area. There were also 2 fatal shootings and multiple others injured as a result of those shootings from the autonomous zone occupied protests. Emergency teams in Myanmar have found over 113 bodies buried by a landslide in Jade Mine. A member of the local civic society group helping the aftermath of the disaster said that those killed were informal workers scavenging the waste left by a larger mining company. And those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Shane, I think the story I want to jump to immediately in this, as I'm reading this, has to be, well, I guess we can go with the China thing later. But right here, Vladimir Putin wins re-election. I love the story because the people in the United States are going to look at the story and say, "Oh, wow, he's whatever," but they have a certain way of looking at him that I think belies what the country may think. Like when I heard Gorbachev, I was watching a video of Gorbachev. I think this may be a year ago, and he was talking about Vladimir Putin, and it seemed, at least in looking at his cadence and whatnot, that he didn't particularly like Putin. By the same token, he accepted that this is necessary. Now, his argument for why it was necessary was basically you have a bunch of vultures that are trying to eat Russia alive, and all of these countries are putting stress on it, led by the United States. And in order to push back against that, you need somebody who's looking out for the interests of the entirety of the country to push back against all of these other forces. And based on what he was saying, and that I took from it, this is the guy. Now, whether or not that changes, he also made that point of like, maybe at some point this changes, in which case a different person may be necessary. But it is a shocking video to watch that I love the honesty of it. I guess this acknowledgement that, yes, he might not be my favorite. By the same token, he's necessary in this instance. What did you think about that? I mean, 2024, 2030, what happens in Russia is none of my business. So there's that. But I think we in this country, when we're looking at that, we're giving a dark eye to something, missing the point that it may be possible that he is that popular. And he probably is that popular, considering he receiving 78% of the vote. There's no reason for me to doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, another way to look at this is that the United States government, through the State Department, the CIA, military-industrial complex, the whole thing has made a business out of making other people's business ours. We've taken on that mantle or whatever. We've taken that mantle, and that's a lot of our disposition towards the world and towards ourselves is based on adopting that role, assuming that position. So that's the sort of, I think, the background perspective that it helps to have when you're looking at this stuff. Again,
I'm curious. Let's move to. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You had more. I'm sorry. There was a space in between, and I wasn't sure.
Oh no, totally. Yeah, no, just sort of collecting my thoughts because for some reason my mind keeps going to Lee Kuan Yew. Totally different politician, but and he was sort of criticized by people in the West, but he was also, liked by a lot of people in the West. Singaporean, arguably the founder of modern Singapore, like intensely industrialized a country. Again, there are a lot of things I don't like about Singapore. My only point in bringing him up, if I'm looking at it correctly, he was the president. He was the head of the country from 1959 to 1990. He was a prime minister, pardon, from 1959 to 1990. Again, that's 31 years in power. As a person in the United States, I can, again, sort of different values, different histories, different cultures, all this stuff. I wouldn't want that in a president because that would be, from my perspective, a sign of the degradation of the American system. But the American system is different from the Russian system, which is different from the Singaporean system. We all have these different legacies. We have different expectations. Another way to look at this, what is democracy if not an attempt at solving the succession problem? The succession problem in political philosophy is just this, you have a ruler. Exactly. You have a set of rulers, whether it's a single person or a conglomerate of people or somebody who's supposed to represent the whole society. They die or they get pushed out of office or whatever. Who follows? At the end of whatever term limits, who's supposed to follow? And democracy, in its different forms, is one attempt at solving that problem of who's going to follow. A problem with American democracy is that, as far as I can tell, there's very little transition because there's this massive state apparatus. Again, the CIA, the quote-unquote deep state, the State Department, everybody, all of these administrative officials and bureaucratic bodies within the federal government, there's this constancy. And so in some senses, we've solved the problem, but with an illusion where we have this figurative difference as we elect a new president every 4 to 8 years. Again, if I look at Russia, I turn to Russia. Within the last 30 years, within a generation, it has gone from being one of arguably the two most powerful countries in the world. Let's just say it, the two most powerful countries in the world. It had been decaying there for a little bit during the later stages of the Soviet Union. You had this collapse, this huge collapse of that system. You have a fairly large bureaucracy that was built up and then just sort of crumbled in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And now, on the other side of that, 13 million? I forget the exact population of Russia, but over 100 million people are dependent on leadership in the country. It's not for me to say what form that leadership takes, but I can understand why they would be looking for a person to help consolidate the government. My only hope, and this is I'm going to put this, the boundaries I'm going to put on this expression are that it is a hope. It's not any kind of intent. My hope is that Putin and the Russian government figures out a way to maintain its stability by finding somebody who can replace him, who can come in and who can take on his mantle, because if you have that continuity, you need flexibility, you need things to adapt as time goes on. There's all these different factors that I think are important to look at with this stuff. You need that. And it makes sense to me that he, as this very prominent figure, again, very well liked by, as far as I can tell, by the majority of people in Russia, it makes sense to me that he would want to maintain that stability. On the other side of that, of course, I'm guessing, I'm pretty darn sure, he's looking for competent people who can replace him because he's getting up into his years. Again, there's a lot of stuff here, but that was my take. I kind of went off into a long thing there. Anything you wanted to say in response, Jamarl?
No. I like the fact that you brought up the Singapore now. What's specific about the Singapore Prime Minister that draws your attention when you think about this, even if it's tangential? I mean, I think it tangents too. So, and sometimes those tangents bring forth kind of interesting insights in regards to what we're talking about. So what is specifically about the gentleman from the Prime Minister of Singapore that draws you, or that you think about in a tangent to this story, the Russian president?
Well, I don't want to fall back on whataboutism, but there's something about the hypocrisy. We were, again, people in the United States would criticize Lee Kuan Yew, but we were also, as far as I can tell, pretty close with the Singaporeans. A lot of trade ties, obviously. Yeah. Again, he was prime minister for 31 years. That's a long time. That's much longer than President Putin has been in power and may yet be in power, even if he gets reelected, as far as I can tell. So, and on the other side, as far as I can tell, Lee Kuan Yew was far more authoritarian. He was far more in terms of curtailing civil liberties. I mean, again, people can get arrested for spitting gum. I might be getting this slightly wrong, but whatever it is, you can be arrested for spitting gum and leaving it out, on a subway in attempts to kind of keep up public hygiene and these different things. That's pretty authoritarian from an American perspective. That's like pretty darn heavy-handed. And yet, I don't really hear people criticizing him too much these days. I mean, again, he's dead. He's been dead for a while, but even looking at, for instance, economists who are looking back at his policies, they'll kind of wring their hands a little bit about some of the stuff they don't like. But broadly, there's this sense of appreciation. And so it's just, again, there's this idea that the Russians were really doing this whataboutism thing for a long time. So I'm kind of tentative to not be like, okay, well, what about, our hypocrisy? But there is this hypocrisy. And I think, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, that came to mind because of that.
The whataboutism is nonsense. I mean, they use that just as an attack point. The reality of it is people throw out whataboutism because they don't want to necessarily own the fact that they're doing the exact same thing that they're accusing somebody else of. And so if you are in that whataboutism stuff, basically you're saying, yes, I acknowledge I am being a massive hypocrite here, but I don't want you to bring up the fact that I'm being a hypocrite. I mean, that's all whataboutism is. I mean, after all, it's like, oh, these guys are supporting X. It's like, well, you're supporting X. Oh, you're being a whataboutist. No, I'm pointing out to you that you are accusing somebody of something that you yourself are doing. I think that's a good point. I really do. I mean, think of how long Angela Merkel's been in, 20 years in power? So even within democracies, you have people who are in there for a long time. Evo Morales has been in there. Well, they deposed him in a coup. I mean, it's something that we probably were involved in also. But some rulers are in power for a long time, and some people want those rulers in power for a long time. FDR went 4 terms. So this is not even necessarily an anathema to our system. Granted, he died in office, but is there any doubt that if FDR was still alive, he would have ran again and won? Not really. I mean, so it's not necessarily insane for a particular leader to be in power for a long period of time. I gotta be honest, I have no feelings about who is in power and the length of time they're in power, providing that the public is okay with them being in power, and that's somebody that the public wants. And it looks, at least to me, that this is indeed what the public wants. And you can even make an argument that perhaps it's what the country, in order to keep itself stable, considering Western aggression, perhaps is what they need. So what happens in Russia is an issue for Russia. That's my point.
I hold to that truly, and it's not. Again, we should throw this out there. We are on Russian government-funded radio. Technically, I think it's Russian taxpayer-funded radio, but that might be a triviality to some. But throwing that in there, still, again, these are just the perspectives. Have a conversation with us. I don't mean to be preemptively defensive about that stuff, but again, if you're listening to us and you disagree with us, or you think we're co-opted or whatever, please call in. Let's have this conversation on the air.
Yes.
Keep it relatively peaceable, as best as you can, just because then we'll respond in kind. But that would be great. Regardless, we're going into a break. We're going to be taking calls this next segment, 202-521-1320. Again, it's 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
news, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. He's disembodied, but I guarantee you he is ever present. We're coming from Washington, D.C., and if you are in the area, you can listen to us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. And if you're in Kansas City, 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you would like to give us a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. And we have a caller, Tarif from New Orleans. What's going on, Tarif?
Good morning, gentlemen. I got two comments. The first comment is dealing with Dr. Jeff Zelenko. He wrote yesterday about the U.S. is buying up the world supply of remdesivir, and it's going to be for patients with that severely ill. Basically, they're going to be giving it to you if you're severely ill with COVID-19. But what he's saying is, because he's the one that's pushing the hydroxychloroquine and zinc, and it seems like it's working. We're still waiting for the trials to come back from it. It's going to be at the end of December. And I think we should look at that. It prevents people from becoming severely ill. His name is Dr. Jeff Zelenko, and I put a link to y'all tweet for today. My second comment is dealing with Egypt and Turkey, dealing with Libya. Egypt is back in Haftar, along with the United Emirates and France and Russia. And United States is back in Turkey, because it seems like Turkey is doing the same thing United States is doing now in that region, dealing with I don't know why Turkey got involved with Libya and also Yemen. I don't know how that became their problem, but it seemed like they became neocons in that region, so that could, if it spun out of control, I can pull in the U.S. and Russia into a conflict. Just pray and hope that won't happen. So I also attached that link to y'all tweet for today, too. That's all I want to say.
Excellent. Thank you for calling in, Tarif. We also have David in Texas. David, how's it going?
Morning. All right. Yeah, I got a take on these Caesar sanctions, that they put on Syria. I've called in the past about wanting to do an apology tour in Syria, for all the cruel and unusual punishment that America's heaped on them. And I just got a hypothetical question for you guys. Say, Russian government gives me a green light. Say, we got your back, David. Come on over to Syria and start this apology tour. Who's going to shut us down, fellas, the left or the right? Who's going to shut that down? Say, I'm going over there and I'm calling back every Friday or so and telling you what's going on, where we're at. And who's going to shut us? Who's going to shut it down is what I'm saying on the left or the right. I'll let you guys respond.
Go ahead, Shane. Who's going to shut us down, left or right?
Neither. Nobody's going to shut us down. I mean, the left and the right both seem to want us to keep getting more involved in Syria and other places. Again, as far as I can tell, this whole bit with the Taliban and the bounties, other than being an attack on Trump, it's also partly, maybe, this is my intuition, it's a response to our attempts to pull out of Afghanistan. That just makes sense. We need to be at war so that we can continue to make weapons, which are a large part of our GDP. That's one side of it. But another side of it has to do with economics and other countries having, partial ownership of the American economy. And as far as I can tell, we also need to keep up our geopolitical predominance so that we can keep the USD as the world's reserve currency, which sort of keeps our economy from going bust. That's a lot of stuff there. And there are parts of that I'd like to get clarified. We've had guests on to talk about more of these things, but broadly, the left and the right, the establishment left and the right at least, seem to be in gridlock. They seem to be walking in lockstep on this one.
Yeah. I mean, the foreign policy from the standpoint of the United States, it tends to be similar on both ends, right? We got into this conversation about consistency for the moment. And one of the things, I guess you could say, in political discourse is how consistently close our parties are. Meaning we don't have these kind of wide expanses, right? We don't have the Socialist Party and this other party. And, we basically have two parties that are mainstream, that are relatively close to one another in regards to their political ideologies. So whether you get a Democrat or a Republican, you don't necessarily get these kind of wide pulls to the left and to the right. I suppose you could say that's intentional. But do we really deviate that much? I mean, when you're going from one administration to the next, like you say, you have this entire bureaucracy that's created that basically to try to keep our system the way our system is. So, I think that might be that's a tangent slightly, but I do think it's somewhat true in the way that we go about our political affairs as opposed to other nations that may have, let's say, a wider degree of options in, let's say, a group or a wider number of parties.
And the thing with having these like giant mechanical organisms, like the State Department, CIA, various parts of what we would call the deep state, what some would call the deep state. The problem with this is that they have their own momentum. They have all their own economic incentives. They have this trajectory, a lot of mass behind this momentum of ideology, of relations with other countries and ideas about how to deal with relations with other countries. And that stuff, there's only so much that can change when a new president comes into office, because again, the president, as far as I can tell, has mostly become a figurehead. Again, making a lot of executive orders, but at the end of the day, the president has to be counseled by people, like any leader, in charge of this very complicated society. And so, if the counselors to the president, if the various advisors and people who are in his ear, if they're just the sort of voices of this larger body with its own momentum, the points for human contact and human intervention, either by the voters or by people in the administration, those are getting smaller and weaker. And that's what's worrying about this stuff, is that it has its own weight and momentum and trajectory. Regardless, though, we're taking calls, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320 is the number to call if you want to join the conversation. That's where we are now. The thing with Syria, the only thing that this is the thing, and I might be wrong about this, unless there's some kind of miracle of a change in public opinion and activity, unless we get a lot more organized, unless people on the left and the right start having conversations and start doing things with those conversations in a way that that is unlikely to be co-opted, unless that happens, it's just a matter of time. Like the U.S. government doesn't seem to be getting stronger over time. It seems like we're sort of using financial infusions from the Fed. We're using all these various mechanisms to keep us from sort of fading in predominance. But the problem is, the more we spend, literally and figuratively, the more energy we expend trying to keep the system in power, it's not supporting productivity in the U.S., which means that it's going to destabilize itself. It's sort of an inherently unstable equilibrium that we're in. And that's the fear, but it's also in some sense the hope. The fear, of course, being what's on the other side of that? What would a collapse look like? What would, even if it's not a full collapse of the United States, I don't think it would be, if it's just a sort of collapse of our international standing and our position in the world, that's going to be pretty catastrophic in a lot of ways. That seems like that would really deeply impact the U.S. economy. So there are fears to be had about how that's going to impact us. But of course, then there's also this hope that with whatever breakdown's coming, and it seems like a breakdown is coming, that there's going to be this opportunity for people who are well organized, who have good policy ideas. There's going to be an opportunity for them to get those things injected into the reformed version of the U.S. government. I'm making some assumptions here, but I don't see another way of this thing going. That's my take. What's yours, Jamarl?
That's interesting. I mean, it does, like you say, entropy, right? Political entropy. Basically, the tendency for the system to basically break down. I think in the beginning, any system has this notion of a higher purpose. So you have a lot of people who come together and say, yes, we want this, or yes, we want that. And those groups have a consistency about it and the way that it operates. But at some point, people get so great and they don't look at this kind of imaginary thing that they were initially organizing around. They look for their own petty ends and their own petty things that they want to get accomplished. And I think that's when you get into dangerous territory. I mean, look at what Republicans saying, no, we're not going to give Obama his Supreme Court pick. That's profound. I mean, that's astonishing. Or Democrats going with a conspiracy theory, trying to take down the president in a soft coup. That's astonishing. But this speaks of a breakdown. We have Louise from Virginia. Louise, how's it going today?
It's going just fine, Jamarl. Thanks to you and Shane. I called in about Russia. And also in regards to what you're just discussing now about a breakdown, you're not bringing in the factor that the army will be called into the street. You're not bringing that up. That's the natural thing to do, and also to start a war, to distract everybody. I called in to defend, to not just to defend, but to praise President Putin. When I first started listening to Radio Sputnik, I looked up President Putin on the internet to listen to what he had to say, to see what he was like, to see what was going on in Russia, in other words. And I came away, the more I heard him, the more I admired him. He's sensible, balanced, intelligent, brilliant, dedicated, etc., etc. You forgot to mention, when you were talking about us not really having a claim to say anything about whether President Putin should be reelected or not, you forgot to say two things. One, and I have nothing to do with Russia, absolutely nothing, except as a citizen, and it's a very important country. You forgot to say two things about Putin, which are crucial. Not about Putin, but about his policy. He had the foresight and the courage and the skill to get rid of the oligarchic vultures who were tearing Russia apart, who want to come back, who want to get rid of him and come back and keep up sucking all the blood out of Russia, all the money, to their own benefit. And you forgot to mention that thanks to him, so far there hasn't been a world war over the Middle East.
Thank goodness. No, you're right about that, Louise. And yeah, we didn't. When I was talking about Russia, when Jamarl and I were talking about this stuff, we didn't bring in Putin's response specifically. And as far as I can tell, this is why he's popular, why he's still very well liked. You had the breakdown of the Soviet Union, 1991. Then you had this period over the course of the next decade.
Boris Yeltsin, Bill Clinton.
Voucher privatization, where you had basically Russian state assets. Again, big oil companies, basically companies that would have rights to Russian resources. And there was this program backed by Harvard. Larry Summers was prominent in this, where they basically were coming at it from an ideological angle economically. And the way that they distributed the shares of these companies was in the form of vouchers to the citizens of Russia. Now, what happened, of course, was oligarchs in Russia and in the West bought those vouchers up for very low prices. In the process of buying those vouchers up, they gained control of these companies, and then subversively, basically, they tried to take ownership of those companies out of Russia, basically putting it again in Western hands. So that's an economic move that really hurt the Russian Federation after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's also a geopolitical move. And so from both angles, people will talk. If you're a critic of Putin, you'll probably focus on the geopolitical angle. Well, he was trying to keep, Russian resources from being entered into the world market or whatever, this sort of world system of trade. Okay, maybe. But at the same time, it was also, again, Western entities, banks, a lot of them very closely connected to the United States geopolitical apparatus, trying to gain control of those resources. And not to mention, because I really haven't yet, a lot of people died. A lot of people in Russia died as a result of the bungling of this program. Yeah,
and what I've heard capitalism. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, very good point to bring up, Louise. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Just wanted to get a little bit deeper into that. And again, Putin came in as somebody who was fighting down those oligarchs, who seems to have successfully pushed a lot of that action off. Again, Bill Browder's story we talked about centers around this process from the mid to late 90s going into the early 2000s. He was one of these vulture capitalists. He was one of these people who was coming in, buying these vouchers, along with Khodorkovsky, along with, again, all of the oligarchs. That's the form that this stuff took. So thank you for bringing that up. Regardless, I think we should go into a break. We're going to be joined in just a minute by Danny Haifong, having a conversation with him about China's new security law, also trying to get deeper into understanding the Hong Kong-China situation. We'll be back in just a minute with Danny. You're listening now to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe, Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my disembodied co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're on, give up the like, share this content. If you want to join the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. So on Tuesday, China's legislature voted to unanimously adopt an expansive new national security law clarifying the security relationship between Hong Kong and its parent company, China. The text of the bill wasn't disclosed, even apparently to Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, until it was passed, kind of like the TPP apparently. Generally speaking, the law criminalizes 4 types of activity: succession, subversion of the state power, terrorism, and collusion with foreign entities, carrying a penalty of up to life in prison. NPR writes, quote unquote, Beijing says the law is crucial to safeguarding Hong Kong's economic development and political stability. Legal experts and Hong Kong civil society leaders say the measure ends once and for all the remaining autonomy the region enjoys under Chinese rule. Now, to discuss the new law, we are joined by contributor to the Black Agenda Report and co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News, Danny Haifeng. Danny, how's it going today?
Hey, how are you doing? What's going on, man?
Excellent. Thank you for joining us. So I was reading the above comment, and I love what's missing in this. Basically, they're acting as if China is doing this for no reason. That, China is just coming in and is just putting in the security law that's criminalizing all of this stuff. Missing the point that the U.S. has had instigations into what was taking place, especially backing the people who are quote-unquote pro-democracy demonstrators. What influence? And better yet, let's start at the beginning. Can you give us just a brief history of Hong Kong and even a small snippet of that, talking about Hong Kong under British rule?
Yeah, because I think if we're going to talk about the national security law, we have to talk about colonialism and the process of decolonization that began during the Opium Wars, I believe beginning in 1842, and leading to the century of humiliation that the British imposed on the region and on broader China that really didn't end until the Revolution of 1949 in many respects. So during the colonial period in Hong Kong, there was virtually no rights. The British government was able to impose things such as the inability to even, garner a minimum wage in Hong Kong. Practices such as flogging were just a normal part of daily life, and the complete inundation of the region with literal opium, because Hong Kong was used as a port for the opium trade, was a huge problem. So the British rule and British colonialism was a catastrophe in many respects. And so it wasn't until 1997 when China was able to regain its territory and to place Hong Kong as a special administrative region, making Hong Kong part of China's sovereign territory. So since then, there have been numerous so-called uprisings, and these uprisings have been backed by the British, have been backed mainly by the United States, to keep this secessionist so-called independence movement going, to try to politically and not just economically, because we have to remember that the regaining of the territory by China also came with the one country, two systems promulgation, which basically allowed Hong Kong to maintain its capitalist characteristics. We have to also remember that China is a socialist country and has been since 1949. So Hong Kong was able to maintain those characteristics, which were basically forced upon it by the British. And now what we are seeing, especially since 2000, risings began as the closing of the loophole of Article 23 of the Basic Law in Hong Kong, which was established after the British and China entered into its joint declaration and gave Hong Kong back to China. There has been this impetus and all of these resources put into place by the United States to support these pro-democracy forces, which are nativist forces, which are pro-colonial forces, which hope to separate Hong Kong once again from China. And this is really where the national security law comes in. Actually, I believe many in China and many millions of people in Hong Kong would argue that this law is decades in the making and maybe decades late, in that, as Hong Kong is sovereign territory of China and a sovereign part of China, China has every right under international law, and especially every right, given the history of colonialism in China and the broader region, to effectively ensure that foreign powers aren't able to do what they were able to do for over a century in the city. So that's really where this new law comes in. It's really about taking the teeth out of the foreign intervention, which has been occurring, especially since 2019, but this is in the making. This is decades in the making. U.S. soft power forces, especially the National Endowment for Democracy, but not only the National Endowment for Democracy, we're talking about the CIA literally calling Hong Kong its listening post for China, that there has been foreign meddling for a really long time, and it has come to a head where there's been actual violence. There has been so-called riots, but really what it is it's a so-called color revolution to try to separate Hong Kong from China. And we've seen so many forms of legislation now, from the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019 to the Hong Kong Autonomy Act of 2020, where the U.S. is taking active steps to make sure that Hong Kong is a point of instability and a point of soft power intervention for the U.S. to try to undermine China's rise.
I think that's what a lot of people don't understand, that it is a soft power intervention. It's not like Hong Kong is doing this entirely on its own. Think back, for example, Charles Johnson, I think I mentioned it once before, where Afghanistan was basically being, the U.S. had put forces, clandestine means, in Afghanistan. Soviet Union knew about it. The Soviet Union intervenes, in which case the entire world says, oh my God, the Soviet Union is attacking that country for no reason. Now, this is kind of something similar to me. If Hong Kong, if China overacts, meaning, invades with military or something to that effect, the world will point fingers to saying, oh my God, look at what China is doing. If China does nothing, and you have Hong Kong being set on fire basically by this kind of revolution type stuff, again, the U.S. points its finger and gets what he wants in either case. So I think what the public doesn't necessarily entirely realize is the number or the amount of instigation U.S. forces have in China that is prompting and provoking this particular response. And this goes with Britain also, correct?
Yes. Yeah. I think what you're saying is exactly right, that there has been conditions created to basically provoke China into taking the next step towards decolonization. And I think for us in the West, in the United States, it has to be emphasized that if we are for the self-determination of people against colonialism, if that's a historic trend that especially progressive people, left-leaning people, and just people in general who believe in social justice, that we have to see this move as actually a positive step. That if we are in line with international law. I mean, we can just see which countries are for and are in solidarity with China around this national security law and which aren't, right? You have, on the one hand, the United States, Britain, and many European countries, Israel, against China's promulgation of this national security law. And then you have Cuba, Belarus, Russia, and others who are, in support of China, because I think what many people don't understand is that national security laws are pretty much par for the course, especially since 9/11, where national security was made a mainstay by the United States as a force for repression. But if we look even further back, when so-called national security may have been even more progressive in a definition of, after the overthrow of colonialism, nations need certain laws to ensure that foreign meddling and that a more powerful country cannot come in and exert its influence, and these laws become even more important. So I think it's important for people in the United States who are seeing just the media hysteria and the right-wing chauvinism of someone like Mike Pompeo throw their arms up about this, to place this in the context of China is really trying to protect its sovereign right to govern its nation, because at this time, Hong Kong is part of China. And if we look at the history of colonialism in that region and in Hong Kong specifically, we can see why there is every need for this law to be put in place, and that the law actually, despite all of the focus on this idea that one country, two systems is over, and that Hong Kong now is just outpost of China, which shouldn't even be seen as a bad thing since it is a part of the nation. There is a lack of understanding that one country, two systems is not ending. China has so much experience over the past 70 years of managing local autonomous regions, for example, Macau, for example, Tibet, where both culture and political systems have been respected, right? In Macau, you have a completely different system than you have in Beijing. So this is not out of China. This is not out of the ordinary for China's history, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the coming months when the realization comes that actually one country, two systems is still in place. Capitalism is still, at least to a great extent, allowed to run amok. It's just that these foreign forces that are creating all of this instability are just unable to operate. And I think that's why you saw people like Joshua Wong and Nathan Law kind of throw in the towel and say, we're not part of Demosisto no more. And then you saw the recent protests, which, I think was kind of part of this PR campaign of, well, we're throwing our hands up because China has repressed us so much, but now we're going to go out to the streets and, wreak more havoc as part of this 1-2 punch of sowing support from the West and the United States.
Danny, we only have about 30 seconds before I want to go into a break, so it's going to have to be quick here. On the other side, I'd like to get into some of the history of this stuff, including the Opium Wars. Again, older things that a lot of people, including myself, don't know that much about. So I want to get into that. But real quick, I'm worried about this stuff, and I'm worried about it on all angles, from all different directions. On the one hand, yes, the U.S. has used Hong Kong as a source of soft power. It's a big sort of post of ours, along with the UK's, in that region. And it is being used against the Chinese. Again, it was originally a Chinese territory. What really bothers me, though, is that there are, last I checked, a little bit over 7 million people living in Hong Kong. Now, the British and the Australian governments, following this the passage of this new law, said that they would permit travel. They would basically give the path to citizenship for millions of the people, not all the people. Hong Kong pushed back, basically saying, China pushed back, saying that this had violated an agreement that the UK had signed with them. Briefly, before we go into the break, what's your take on that situation? Again, in about 30, 40 seconds.
Yeah, just briefly, I would say that situation is a blatant violation of China's sovereignty. It's attempting to use it, the influence of the West and the imperialist West to try to upend the political situation in Hong Kong through different means, and that's through migration and brain drain et cetera, and it's trying to curry the pro-American, pro-UK forces into leaving. Some could see that as a beneficial thing, but on the other hand, there is this direct intervention of trying to literally cause a migration crisis from Hong Kong to the UK, which needs to be, I think needs to be opposed on the fact that it violates sovereignty.
All right, more on this topic, including the history on the other side of this break. We're joined now by Danny Haifong. We'll be back in just a minute. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Tune in every Friday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a weekly segment of the worst mainstream media headlines of the week. They tell us what's behind the worst, most misleading, and funniest headlines from around the news with Steve Patt of the blog Left Eye on the News. Together, they pull apart the corporate media's bias, spin, and downright lies. Tune in this Friday and every Friday for the worst and most misleading headlines of the week.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to the voices of Shane Stranahan, Jamarl Thomas, and Danny Haifong. Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, that's myself. We co-host Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, which you're listening to. And we're joined, of course, now by Danny. Danny Haifong is a contributor to the Black Agenda Report. He's also the co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News. You can follow Danny on Twitter at Spirit of Ho, Spirit of H-O. So there's stuff I kind of want to respond to there, stuff I disagree with, but I think it's prudent, as in so many things, to give context before we get into conflict. So maybe we can go back and get into some of the history here. Would you be willing to walk us back through the relations between the United Kingdom, between the British Empire, effectively, and China in the 18th and 19th centuries, sort of the inaugurating events of this longer term problem?
Yeah, so, a very controversial war. There were two opium wars beginning in the 1840s where the British basically used a part of China as a trading outpost of opium, spread the drug all across the country and create essentially a humiliation where what was once a very vibrant empire in China, its own kind of society, was basically placed under complete and utter poverty, illiteracy, as well as the rampant addiction. And so, in the 1860s, there was another opium war, and that sort of culminated in this century of humiliation that people in China still talk about as wanting to avoid, and there is a lot of strong fervor against any sort of direct forms of interfering in China's affairs. And during that time, it's so interesting in Hong Kong, especially, there was a judicial system that was put into place which was not governed by the people of Hong Kong themselves. So all the talk about pro-democracy among these protesters, it's not really talked about how the judicial system still in Hong Kong, right? China didn't change this system during the signing of the Joint Declaration in 1997. This system is still relatively the same, except it's not run by foreign actors anymore. This judicial system was put into place so that foreign powers like Britain and the United States would be able to control the economy of that port city. So, in effect, over that 100 years, you had no democracy at all. You didn't have one country, two systems. You didn't have elections where people could actually participate in them who lived in Hong Kong. It was all governed by the colonial administration. Now, since 1997, there is a form of, kind of Western democracy there, but it's still through the same judicial system, which basically empowers finance capital. I mean, real estate development in Hong Kong is more prevalent than anywhere else in terms of its just power over society. You have this enormous amounts of poverty and austerity that exists there, and this rampant inequality, which has been a source of tension. And we have to remember that a lot of these economic grievances that people have, unfortunately, have been redirected at blaming mainland China, because a very interesting thing happened beginning in 1997 and into 2020, which is that finance capital, neoliberal capital, began to erode this sort of exceptionalism, this sort of superiority that people in Hong Kong, especially on the right, had about China, right? China was a very poor country, even leading into 1997. Over the last 20 years, there has been a huge industrial boom in China, and a lot of it is because of the state planning and the ability to manage the contradictions of capitalism through the state. But in Hong Kong, something different happened. Rather than wages rising, rather than the ability to mitigate economic crises, rather than the ability to address poverty, Hong Kong has gone the opposite direction. And so a lot of people's grievances and anger about that have been channeled by people like Jimmy Lai against mainland China, and seeing mainland Chinese workers and mainland Chinese people as not only competitors, but people who are literally draining Hong Kong's economy, which is completely false, since the U.S. and the U.K. are the major forces in Hong Kong economically speaking. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that there is this economic basis for this anti-China sentiment, which is being redirected in a completely negative direction, in a direction that's kind of out of line with reality. But it's in every interest for the forces that the United States supports to push this narrative that China's taking over, and that China is trying to upend and destroy the sovereignty of Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious. Has there been any polling from? I'm sorry. Has there been any polling from the standpoint of Hong Kong? I would be very curious to know how many people in Hong Kong would actually want to some kind of reunification. Also, what did they expect? I mean, in 40 years, China was supposed to, the two-system thing was supposed to break down anyway, meaning something had to take place in those 40 years that would have brought those systems closer together regardless. Meaning, if that indeed was going to take place, then the issue was never going to stop at a protest against a particular law or a particular bill. It was always going to go to this notion of freedom from China, because it doesn't make sense otherwise. If your country is going to be reunified in 40 years and you're complaining about a bill, an extradition bill, well, I think you're missing a boat in regards to the complaints, but that's just it. All of these complaints was going to always escalate to this notion of we want independence from China. I'm curious on how many people in Hong Kong actually hold that particular point of view, that they want some kind of separation from the mainland government. Also, and what were the reasons for the economic depression in Hong Kong that caused all of this?
No, it's a very good question. I think Hong Kong is very divided, and that is a big problem that I think China is now taking seriously, due to the fact that, when you have a century of colonialism, when that city was used in the way that it was used, there were a lot of forces that were cultivated to especially oppose the Chinese Revolution and socialism, but more broadly to oppose any sort of incursion on the colonial relationship that Hong Kong had with Britain and, of course, the U.S. imperial power. So it is divided, right? And so these protests are not small. However, they have been overblown. There have been, reports of millions in the streets. Hong Kong is a city of around 8 million, a little less. And while there are large forces that believe that China, should not be interfering in its so-called sanctified relationship with the West, on the other hand, there are many people who don't agree, right? I would say that there are at least 2.5, 3 million people which have been shown to have signed a position in favor of the national security law. So the society is divided, and I think it'll take a while for, a new kind of consciousness to emerge, because one of the ways in which that U.S. soft power, British soft power, colonial soft power has been able to maintain a stranglehold in Hong Kong is through the university system, through the media, there has been a whole generation of young people, especially young middle-class students, who have been basically brainwashed into believing that the UK and the US are their saviors and that they have every interest in latching on to them. And it completely negates the fact that, to your question about the economic crisis in Hong Kong, I mean, what really has caused the economic crisis in Hong Kong is the rampant inequality and the fact that Hong Kong is basically reliant upon the most volatile section of capital, finance capital, and that real estate development, private real estate development, has used Hong Kong as basically, a huge Ponzi scheme to annihilate and destroy the economy. And so you have so many people in Hong Kong living in micro apartments and living in conditions of squalor because, real estate does not produce jobs. Finance capital does not really produce jobs. And then people look over at the mainland and see wages rising, jobs being produced, and, an overall different economic situation. There tends to be resentment, especially when all you hear from, for example, Hong Kong University and all of these sites of U.S. soft power, that China is the reason for these problems, and that it's China's, newfound relationship to Hong Kong as being part of its sovereign territory is the reason. And I think that's what led to this huge sentiment of, well, we want to be part of the UK again. It was this nativist, chauvinist, very pro-colonial mentality, which has been honestly developed over the course of, a century plus, but especially in the last 20 plus years in the 21st century, we've seen this increase astronomically as the investment in that sort of political push has become more and more just fruitful and more important.
So, Danny, I'm gonna come back, and maybe we can get into the disagreement here. Again, it seems to me about 3 million people out of the almost 7.5 million people in Hong Kong would be eligible if Britain wanted to take them in. Now, I'm not going to push back at all on the idea that you were bringing up, that there's been this long-term propaganda. That just happens. Different governments have interests, and again, Hong Kong as this sort of remnant of a British colony, it makes sense to me from a just pure realpolitik perspective that Britain would want to do that. Not excusing it at all. On the other hand of this side, I'm looking at it from sort of the individual's perspective. If I grew up in Hong Kong and I had my values, Shane's values, American values, or whatever, I would want to be able to leave if there were this big push, especially since things have been accelerated, since people who might have thought they could leave a decade or a couple of years from now suddenly have no choice but to sort of accede to this. And just morally, looking at it as a person, I think that they should be allowed to leave. But again, like you were bringing up, again, they have been propagandized. There is this dissident aspect of their leaving that could come back to haunt China. So I understand from a geopolitical perspective why China might not want that. But also, if these people are going to be dissidents, it seems like it's better for them to be dissidents somewhere else. Like as you were saying in your initial response, it would make sense for China to not want these people in there. I don't mean to be too heavy with the pushback here, but can I, in about 30 seconds before we go out, 30 seconds, what's your take?
Yeah, well, I don't think, China's not opposed to travel. China's not opposed. They're not going to take a heavy line on this. The big issue is that the U.S. and the UK are coming in with direct legislative measures to interfere in the affairs of China. That's really where China is at odds. I mean, people from Hong Kong is, has been able to maintain its capitalist system. People travel all the time and even go live somewhere else. And that's not something China is really going to, protest. It's, I think, the fact that this is a direct intervention, that the encouragement of dissidents leaving is at the behest of a foreign power, which is really the problem. It's not the fact that, if people want to leave, people can leave.
Thank you, Danny. It's not sadly, we have to go out now. We're going into the end of our break. Really glad to have you, though, Danny. We can continue this conversation later, hopefully have some more interesting ones. Regardless, that was the voice of Danny Haifong. He's a contributor to the Black Agenda Report, also the co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News. You can follow Danny on Twitter at spiritofho, H-O. You can also check his work out at blackagendareport.com. Another great hour coming up. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
to Radio Sputnik.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for the show that brings you all sides of the issues that really matter. Truth, beauty, wonder, danger, we're bringing it to you. In the independent corner, I am investigative radio host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the ever-vigilant lefty on the show in this quarter, Jamarl Thomas, political analyst.
Together, we constitute the best show ever. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, going into headlines now. We're going to be going over some older stuff, also going over the jobs numbers. In our first headline, CIA Director Gina Haspel and National Security Agency Director Paul Nakasone are meeting with a group of congressmen known as the Gang of Eight to go over reports that Russia was paying bounties to the Taliban to kill coalition forces. President Trump has said he was not informed of this possibility and that many deemed it unlikely. Andre, if we could we please play that Trump clip? Wanted to get to this last hour. This is a clip of Donald Trump yesterday talking about the bounties. Again, Russia supposedly placed on the Taliban Russia supposedly paid to the Taliban forces to place on coalition forces, including Americans. But regardless, let's go to this clip from Donald Trump.
If there's ever a scenario in which Russia puts a bounty on U.S. troops, how would you respond?
First of all, they'd hear about it, but we never heard about it because intelligence never found it to be of that level where it would rise to that. When you bring something into a president, and I see many, many things, and I'm sure I don't see many things that they don't think rose to the occasion. This didn't rise to the occasion. And from what I hear, and I hear it pretty good, the intelligence people many of them didn't believe it happened at all. I think it's a hoax. I think it's a hoax by the newspapers and the Democrats.
So based on what you've been briefed, do you think it is?
I agree with the intelligence people. I think, frankly, that many of the intelligence people didn't think it was something that even happened.
Again, was the voice of Donald Trump. He was talking about the Taliban bounties supposedly paid out by Russia to kill coalition forces. Again, unsourced intelligence. He's saying he never heard about it. Regardless, we can talk about that more later. In the second headline, the British and Australian governments are considering offering a path to citizenship for up to 3 million Hong Kong citizens. We just spoke about this with Danny Haifong, so you probably just heard about this. But for people who are just coming in, again, it's going on. China has threatened Britain with countermeasures, saying that the United Kingdom had promised not to offer residency to people living in Hong Kong. The Russian constitutional reform that would reset President Vladimir Putin's term limit, Russian President Vladimir Putin's term limit, has passed, receiving 78% of the vote. Several hundred other reforms were also passed with this vote. Putin will now be able to run for re-election in 2024 and again in 2030. The European Union has laid out new travel recommendations to be adhered to by its member states, opening borders to 14 countries. Countries from which citizens can now travel to Europe are, and this is a list, Algeria, Australia, Canada, Georgia, Japan, Montenegro, Morocco, New Zealand, Rwanda, Serbia, South Korea, Thailand, Tunisia, and Uruguay. Notably not on that list are the U.S. and China. The U.S. is absent due to our ongoing problems handling the spread of the novel coronavirus, whereas China is absent due to the fact that they are currently banning travel from the European Union. After Mayor Bill de Blasio last week decided to paint Black Lives Matter in front of Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, Trump responded on Twitter, and I'm just going to read his response out here. I think it's all sort of interesting and representative. But regardless, here's Trump. NYC is cutting police funds by $1 billion, and yet the New York City mayor is going to paint a big, expensive yellow Black Lives Matter sign on Fifth Avenue, denigrating this luxury avenue. This will further antagonize New York's finest, who love New York and vividly remember the horrible BLM chant, pigs in a blanket, fry 'em like bacon. Maybe our great police, who have been neutralized and scorned by a mayor who hates and disrespects them, won't let this symbol of hate be affixed to New York's greatest street. Spend this money fighting crime instead, ! And end quote. So that was Trump. We'll talk more about that maybe in a minute. We're going to have some calls. Regardless, though, continuing on with the headlines. The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone / Capitol Hill Occupied protest has been cleared in Seattle on Mayor Jenny Durkan's orders. Police said on Twitter they had made 31 arrests. U.S. Attorney General William Barr jumped in, saying the message of today's action is simple but significant. The Constitution protects the right to speak and assemble freely, but it provides no right to commit violence or defy the law, end quote. In the park, people discussed racism and systemic inequality, gave speeches, painted murals, handed out snacks, and a community garden was set up at a park in the area. There were also multiple fatal shootings and multiple others injured as a result of those shootings in the zone. Emergency teams in Myanmar have found over 113 bodies buried by a landslide at a jade mine. A member of a local civil society group helping in the aftermath of the disaster said those killed were informal workers scavenging the waste left by a larger mining company, which sadly, she added, means they're not likely to be due any pay. Their families are not likely to get any pay from this because they were independent freelancers. In our last story, and this is new, this came out towards the end of last hour, jobs numbers are in. U.S. has added 4.8 million jobs as unemployment fell to an 11.1% rate. The nation has now recovered roughly 1/3 of the 22 million jobs it lost to the pandemic recession. That's the news. You're all caught up on it. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. So I was talking about this, and I think maybe we can come back to it. The Trump thing, I admit, I've read that full tweet out a few times now. It's a little bit silly to read the full thing out. But not only is it slightly entertaining, but it also does, I think it gives some context to this thing. Emotional context, a bunch of things. Regardless, one other thing I wanted to come back to, actually, was Muriel Bowser, DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, created the Black Lives Matter, not mural, but I guess you could call it a mural, on the street. Similarly, words were out in front of the White House. Shortly thereafter, an autonomous zone was created. We were talking about Ford Fisher about that autonomous zone, the BHAZ, the Black House Autonomous Zone. I'm curious if this is going to turn into an autonomous zone, because if you think about it, it's right out in front of Trump Tower. It might even be the CHAZ, the Trump Tower Autonomous Zone, or something like that. I'm just thinking of names. I'm curious if that's going to happen. I could see it because, again, as a sort of piece of art, it would also be a point of congregation for protesters. It's right out in front of Trump Tower. I'm just curious if that's where this might be headed.
That's curious, right? That's a good question, right? I don't think so. I mean, it depends on whether or not the government or the local government is okay with it. And there's something about these autonomous zones that bother me, just in principle. By the same token, what is wrong with your government that produces this? Meaning, if your society was cohesive, people weren't under stress, people weren't struggling in the way that they struggle just to get from point A to point B. It's like from cradle to grave with somebody's hands in your pocket, hitting you on your head all the time. If that wasn't life, if you didn't have all of these people unemployed, or if you didn't have what they consider to be inequities and justice, if you didn't have any of this stuff, would you have autonomous zones? And I would say no. The reason that you have these autonomous zones, like I said, they bother me greatly, has to do with a breakdown of your societal order, where people believe that we can do better than this, or we don't like this, or something is wrong with this. I think a lot of that boils down to the inequities that are in our system, with people trying to come up with better ways to organize themselves. Problem is, if other people are living there, those other people who are living there may not necessarily like you taking over their property, which is where I come in at. It feels like the issue is fixing your government, fixing your state, and to come away with the assessment that, well, the wider public, we can't get the wider public, so we're going to just create our own zone where we're going to carve out as our own. Well, are you under U.S. law or not? And if you're not under U.S. law, what do you mean? The people who are living there don't have access to cops if anything goes wrong? And even if you come up with your own policing system, how do people, it's just so many questions associated with this notion of carving out a section to say, okay, this is going to be sovereign territory from a bunch of people who now just carved it out. I think it's just problematic on a few counts. Legally, not to mention problematic for the people who live in that area that you took over, who they had no interest or intent for to have this group take over. So we have a caller. So Karen from Maryland. Karen, how's it going?
Oh, hey, good morning. Listen, I have an issue to bring up about all of these statues toppling over. But let me ask you if you have any insight into this. When I try to call the afternoon shows, the shows that are on after you all, I keep getting this message that the number that I've dialed is not a working number, VA01ML. Please check the number and dial again. Do you have any insight into that?
I don't. I mean, as far as I know, the number is the same, 202-521-1320. Shane, any idea?
No insight. When I was an audio engineer, I've been an audio engineer, a producer, now a host on a radio show, which is a weird set of perspectives to hold all in your mind at once. But when I was an audio engineer, I would be sitting in the room editing stuff, and I would get those calls in off hours. So I don't think that there's any automatic shutoff. Maybe things have changed since the lockdown went in, but we've also had weird reports of people, they didn't give you the code. They didn't read out the code like you did, so I'm not sure if that matches up. But I've had reports from people who've tried to call in, and they've said they've gotten a weird non-response that reminds me of what you're saying. So I don't know if there's a problem there. It wouldn't surprise me if there is some problem there. If so, hope to fix it. What else, Karen?
Okay, well, about these statues toppling down, let me give you a perspective on this because this aspect of it has not been discussed in the press, okay? I do not condone violence, don't condone vandalism, don't condone, crimes with victims, okay? But having said that, everybody needs change of pace, a change of scenery once in a while. If these statues and monuments were to come down, okay, peacefully and in an orderly fashion, somebody would have to order them removed, and someone would have to go on record ordering them removed. So I just wondered who was going to do that. I mean, if the you follow what I'm saying, but I mean, the two ways the statues could come down is an act of vandalism, such as what has happened, or that somebody could order them removed, and someone would have to go on record ordering a statue or a monument removed. And, I just don't see anybody doing that, so I wanted to share that perspective.
Well, I'm going to push back on that slightly. Jamarl, you can come in too. But I have seen, again, just in the last couple of days, I think it was yesterday in Richmond, Virginia, work crews took down the General Stonewall Jackson.
They did.
These things can happen through the sort of civil legislative process. They can happen by local vote. It doesn't have to be through force. It doesn't have to be through force outside of the political system. I understand why people are doing it, but I personally disagree with it. I think so many things. Jamarl, what's your take?
So I agree that it can be taken down by an active government. But I think I disagree on the sense of I'm not against these statues being pulled down outside of the political space. Now, the reason I say that is anything that's a political thing is just what's backed by force. Where's the sovereign in this situation? Ideally, you have a collective of people who come together with a consensus, but oftentimes not. I mean, you have a consensus of people saying, well, Medicare for all, the government doesn't care. And right now, Trump gives trillions while the rest of the public suffers. So it's like your political instrument has been so utterly detached from what the public wants, and you're having this crisis of conscience all at once. I would make the case that the people who are pulling down the statues can't make a legal justification argument for it, because the argument and the justification is not legal. The argument and justification is one of moral conscience that cries out for these things to not be there. I mean, I get it. I lived in Richmond, Virginia. I drove up and down Monument Avenue. And if there was a situation where I saw a group of people who were ripping down the statues, I may be bothered by it also from the standpoint of, whoa, that looks aggressive. But from an intellectual level, just looking at it, I mean, these guys were fascist terrorists that tried to take down the U.S. government because they wanted to keep slaves. Should we keep those up as monuments to, this implicit eternal reverence of these guys who are basically monsters? I can't say I'm against it.
I'm not against it either. There's a lot of stuff to talk about here, and I want to talk about it, but we should go into a break now. We're taking calls. This next segment, 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, that's 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information.
Kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone. You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment. You can call in 202-521-1320. Our lines are open. We've been getting some reports of weird stuff going on, but right now we're definitely getting and happily taking calls. Also, if you want to listen to us on the radio and you're in Washington, D.C., you can catch us on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City, we're on 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, online, we're all over the place. Spreaker, Stitcher, YouTube, Periscope, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Spotify. The list goes on and on. I think that's encompassing that, though. You can catch us on there. And please, if you like what we're putting down, share those videos and audios. Like them, all that stuff. I want to come back here, though. So I'm going to come at this from another angle. We were just talking about statues, legitimate ways of taking down these statues, whether it's justified or proportional or legitimate to try to take these down directly by force without going through a local governmental process. I will come at this from another weird angle. If you want a peaceful revolt, if you want a peaceful reform of the United States government, and I think if you look at it, you're only going to get an effective revolt if it's peaceful. I'll put it like this. Again, we're talking about the military cracking down. The military, as far as I can tell, you have these different spheres of society that have sort of leaned more left or more right. So the universities, arguably in different ways, have leaned more left. Again, not saying true left in whatever sense that means. Arguably, the military is leaning more right. Again, not saying true right, but whatever that means in the modern political context. If you want to have a peaceful revolt, if you want to have a peaceful reform of the political system, I think you need messaging that stretches across the base from left to right. Because if you get that, then you get the people in positions of power who've been disenchanted with the system for a long time. You get those people, and they're actually able to buy into it. They're able to support it. They're able to push for the political reforms that we need to save our country. When I look at people taking down these statues, doing it through extrajudicial processes, just doing it by force, I just see that as ratcheting up the divide between the left and the right. So again, I'm coming at it from a slightly weird angle, a couple steps removed or something like that. But in general, I think what we need, you can also look at the CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, Capitol Hill Occupied Protest, whatever. One way of looking at this is you have a bunch of anarchists, and at points in my past I've identified as an anarchist, like a philosophical anarchist specifically. You have a bunch of people who are coming together to try to create a new small society. Unfortunately, their culture is so screwed up that within the first couple of weeks, a lot of people are dying. Like, if you're going to have a small state without laws, you need to have a common set of civic codes or ethics, something that people can ascribe to, because apparently just falling back on modern human nature doesn't cut it. People very quickly get killed. So again, looking at this from a sort of grand cosmic national angle, whatever, I think what we need is to go about this peacefully, productively, and sensibly, and that's the best way it's going to happen. Otherwise, people acting, again, I can understand why they're acting this way, but I don't justify it because it's myopic in my opinion. If you're tearing down these statues, if you're going through these extrajudicial processes with violence, with force, then you're just increasing the likelihood of the government responding with force. And so practically, I don't think these people are thinking this stuff through enough. That's my take.
That's a fair point. I do think that, look, like I said, there's no, if you're asking me, it depends on the lens that you're looking at it. If I'm looking at it from this very basic point of, is this a moral, ethical thing to have this person there shining with reverence over the course of time, despite the fact that basically it's a rewrite of history? No, I think it's grossly immoral to have those statues there. By the same token, legally speaking, does it allow a excuse for state to get further involved in regards to repressing the various protesters? Yes, that's also true. So it's not one or the other. It's one of those things where, yeah, I understand why you were taking down those statues, and I would even tacitly approve. By the same token, the state has every rationale in the world under its own idea of who's in power and its own sovereign controls over things to intrude upon that process. Because not every community may agree with it. You may have some communities that say, yeah, fair enough. Like Richmond, they say, okay, fair enough, we're going to take them down. But you have some that may not. I mean, the one in New Mexico where the guy ends up, a right-winger shoots a guy after getting into a fight with the people who are trying to pull down the statue of basically a guy who's committed a massacre. So I agree with you, Shane. It's not that I do one or the other. I guess I look at it as both are true. Am I bothered by them taking it down? No, not in one least. Do I understand that law gets involved with that process almost as an automatic thing? Unfortunately, yes, I do. Would I want those societies to be able to come to some kind of resolution to take the statues down? Yes. Will they do that? No. And that's kind of where we get into this kind of conversation of, how much effort and energy gets put into trying to just take down a symbol, an icon, as opposed to dealing with the real material concerns. I would prefer to deal with the real material concerns, even though I cry no tears for those statues coming down or for the people who are doing it. I can't be bothered by it. You know what I mean? I can't even dredge up being bothered by it, even though I get from the standpoint of sovereign and who has the ability to dispense force, maximum justice. Well, yeah, it does get the criminal justice system involved in something far more ways than I would have preferred. So I agree.
Yeah, I would put it like this. Another way to look at this: our brains and our capacity to care about things is limited, and it's good for us spiritually to try to expand our ability to care about things and like the number of things we know and can pay attention to. But it's limited. We're limited, everybody, and that's a serious thing that we run up against. Why I'm saying that? We're spending a lot of time on symbolic stuff that does nothing, and we're allocating our care to actions that aren't going to reap rewards. And I don't want to dismiss people's reasons for caring, but you got to do better stuff with your emotions. You got to productively channel your emotions. You got to understand them, understand their causes, and then figure out what's actually right to do, what's going to help you, what's going to help the country, all this stuff. Again, I can imagine, and I'm trying to come up with a sort of resolution of a lot of these political divides deep down in the country. I think there's something about facing up to our past, accepting our past, looking at it through an American lens, saying we can do better and we need to, and then doing that. I can see that process tying the country together in a very deeply unifying and beautiful way. Now, that's a really hard thing to do. So everything is easier said than done, but a lot of things are easier done than thought. It's a lot easier to do some things than we might expect. Again, systems have been created, systems have been dismantled, all in very short periods of time, depending on the conditions. And I think we need to come back to some productive, unifying message. And that means looking at our history, means looking at what's going on in the present, means analyzing our government, looking at our relationships around the world, this whole thing. We need a better conversation. And when I say we, I don't include the elites, because the elites are not going to give that conversation to us. They're in their own world. They have their own media complex. They have their own power that to them at least seems relatively unhindered by everything we're doing out here in the streets. In our cases, in our homes, I suppose, we're on the radio. But when I say we, the people that I'm trying to speak to are the people who are all aligned against the same thing. I'll put it like this. I don't mean to denigrate the Russians. I work for the Russians. There's this phrase, the Russian firing squad, and that's pretty denigrating to Russians. You're all lined up in a circle around the same person, and in the process, you all end up shooting each other. That's kind of what's going on here, and that's not good. I don't think there should be firing squads in general. That's a whole other conversation. But that's not the right way to go about doing this. We're so lost in our universal opposition to each other that in a weird way, it's I don't know. I'm kind of fading out here. We need to find some better way to solve these problems. We need to find some more productive thing. What's your take, Jamarl?
The opposition to one another, though, has a lot to do with needs. Say for the moment you put a lot of people in a sandbox, and you have a finite amount of items in that sandbox that those people need to live. Are those going to be the best people or the worst of people? It's going to bring out the worst. Those people, if you're looking at animals and you put an animal feed or something like that, those animals, they try to fight for their resources and they'll be willing to do so, as opposed to having surplus, in which case you have what you need to get by. Now, that doesn't solve everything, because you have some people who are just greedy and sadistic and are not satisfied with having enough. They just want to have this kind of a lot more than you. So fair enough. But what happens if you were growing up in an alcoholic family? What is your perspective of the world with an alcoholic dad that was a rageaholic, or an alcoholic mother or something? Does that skew how you look at the world when you're growing up and propagating? The answer is, of course, yes. If you were raised by your grandparents, does that create a difficulty for you, almost like a hurdle to get over, that has crippled a lot of kids growing up? Well, yeah, that's true. That's not determinative for everybody, but if you're looking at 70% of the population that may go through X or Y and they come out in a different way, then yeah, I'm going to say that this condition of putting a human being in it and our capitalist system operates and puts out this particular circumstance. So I agree with you, but it's almost like we're expecting people who were in a caustic, difficult system to all of a sudden be the better of their angels as they chaotically try to reconcile their society and the things that their society was doing from a historical standpoint. I don't expect that process to be beautiful, at least not in the beginning. I don't expect that process to even be anything other than chaotic, because that's just kind of the way these things kind of go. I would prefer it to move into something that is clarified in regards to its wants beyond defund the police, because I think it has to go there. In fact, we have a caller, John from Maryland. John, what's going on? John, can you hear me? Okay, John might have left. Oh, there you are, John.
Yeah, we're talking about Kamala Harris. I think Biden should pick her as the VP.
Why?
Because the reason why I like her, I think she has a mean streak. She can stand up to the Republicans, and she's articulate. You know, that's one of Biden's real problems. You know, they're speaking problems. So he's not really articulate. She can articulate the message for the Democrats. Now, as far as the Confederate statues, why don't they just put them on private property of the Confederates in the South and their cemeteries? There are plenty of private property there that they can put these statues on.
That's a good point. But beyond, wait. I want to go back to Kamala Harris for a moment. And I don't mean to keep you because we're almost out of time. But what about the fact that the protesters and many of the people are arguing defund the police? And Kamala Harris has been caught joking about putting a homeless mother or threatening a homeless mother with prison. She was homeless with 2 kids, and Kamala Harris was threatening her with prison for truancy violations, or laughing about putting stoners in prison or keeping a man on death row. Like, what, in the context of her record and in the context of what the people are asking for, you don't think there's a contradiction there in regards to Kamala Harris in the prison issue or the cop reform issue?
To the center on a lot of, you know, sometimes you change your positions. She'll be a lot liberal. I think she's a lot liberal than a lot of people think she is.
That's fair. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I just wanted to get an idea of what you were saying. Thank you for calling, John. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people mention Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris's name has apparently been bumbling up. Look, my only thing to you is that when you're choosing somebody, it's not about meanness entirely. It's not even about your ability to slash and burn at the other person. I don't think you're going to out-mean Trump, basically. I don't think you're going to do it. I do think you deal with people like Trump by focusing just on how he miserably failed. I mean, think about what's taking place. Joe Biden is right now running for president in his basement. Why? Because Trump has lost points across the board. You have a situation where Trump was like 14 points down in New York's poll. But you can look at poll after poll after poll after poll, even in super states, showing Donald Trump losing miserably. And here's the catch. I know a lot of people say, well, what about 2016? Donald Trump wasn't in office in 2016. Oh! News. Ghislaine Maxwell busted. I have to find that out. And we're going to bring that up probably in the next hour or so, just kind of as a news thing if we get the blurb for it. But yeah, Ghislaine Maxwell busted. Look, let me, bottom line, I just make the point of this. Obama, African-American, 95% of income gains to the top 1%. Think about what that means. Of all the people who are working in the United States, cooks, cleaners, haberdashers, the people who do your roads, the people who write your computer programs, all of those people make our society go, the person who pours your coffee. And with all of the work all across the United States, despite the fact that you go in, you do a job, you go home, given the formative years of your life, your mental energies and physical energies, and what happens is that 95% get expropriated to the top 1%. There's no way you can tell me that's fair. And Obama's blackness didn't stop that from taking place. We're going to take a break here. We're going to be back with Richard Wolff. That is going to be awesome. He's one of my favorite people. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you live from our station in D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us the like, share this video. If you want to join in to the conversation, you can send a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. Now, I think it's fair to say that the United States government has not been a picture of rationality, if indeed rationality is tethered to preservation of life and limb. The richest country on the planet, who had 3 to 4 months advance notice that the pandemic was going to hit, has lost 130,000 human beings with 3 million infected, with 40,000 being affected just yesterday, meaning we're hitting new records after believing that the peak was behind us. To put this in perspective, we have 4% of the world's population, with 25% of the affected population from around the world being in our country. To this chaotic loss of life that trumps the rest of the world, it was amplified by job losses of tens of millions of people, not to mention tens of million people starting eviction next month, as the government gave all due speed and powers, in regards to cash, to the preferable class, while letting the rest of us go bust. To discuss, we're joined by Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York.
He dropped.
Professor Wolff. Oh, okay, fair enough. Okay, so we're going to be joined by Professor Wolff in a moment. We're going to bring him back. But we have new job numbers that are out. Now,
and Ghislaine Maxwell.
And that's right. Ghislaine Maxwell has been busted, apparently. Now, we kept asking, how on earth is this woman walking around? If you got Epstein, how do you not have Ghislaine? Like, the moment that you put Epstein in prison, you already create the legal basis to say, well, he needed a madam, or at the very least, a madam was instrumental in what he was doing. And this person is all around the world. It's like, where in the world is Ghislaine Maxwell? Well, apparently, Ghislaine Maxwell is sitting in a jail today. So we're going to get more information on that as the show goes on.
I can come in with this a little bit here, hoping to get Richard Wolff back on. In fact, I hear he is back on, but real quick as an update, she was arrested by the FBI in New Hampshire. It's breaking everywhere. I hear that NBC was the first outlet to report this. We'll have more on this. Again, one quick note, actually, before we forget, we'll mention this again at the end of the show. We're not going to be on tomorrow. Tomorrow is a federal holiday. We're off. If you don't hear us, don't freak out. We're not taken down or anything like that. We're just taking the day off. But regardless, with all that stuff out of the way, those breaking news updates out of the way, we have Professor Wolff back on the air. Jamarl, you were introing him. You had a bunch of stuff you were bringing to him. You want to take it over?
I was introing. I gave Professor Wolff an amazing intro, and he just abandoned us. How are you doing, Professor? You doing all right?
Okay, I'm sorry about that disconnection of the telephone, but I didn't abandon you. I'm here.
I'm teasing. Thank you for joining us. Let me ask you this. If Karl Marx was walking around the United States today, and let's say he stopped at Starbucks, He just kind of was walking through the streets. And he said at home, and he was on a YouTube video. What would he say in regards to his appraisal of what is taking place right now in the United States in the context of time in general?
Well, I think, assuming that he's as smart as I suspect he is, I think he would have to say, especially if he were in an honest mood, that everything is falling apart. The sense of American people, many of them across the political spectrum, is a sense which I think is accurate, that the civilization, the system, the country that we took for granted with its good parts and its awful parts is falling apart. It has, if you allow me the cliche, it has kicked the can down the road one time too many problems not resolved, not solved, not overcome, and now all of those failed efforts to deal with problems are crashing in on us all at once. We have, let's be honest, we have the climate crisis, the rising temperatures of the air and the ocean, with all that implies to threaten us. We have a disease, a virus, which may in fact be part of all of that climate disaster crashing in on us in the ways you just finished describing. We have an economic collapse that is the worst capitalism failure in a century, since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And we are confronting the unresolved institutional systemic racism that has been a plague on the American society from its beginnings. And those are all problems, in a sense, we've known about. Nothing is new here. Let me end by underscoring that. Capitalism has had its crashes every 4 to 7 years for 300 years. There's nothing new about it. The human race, including us in America, have been plagued by bad viruses on and off for our entire history, for centuries. The climate problem has been brought to us, for decades now, ever since Rachel Carson wrote her book. And finally, I don't have to tell anybody that racism from the days of slavery on has been an unresolved problem in this country. And so here we are. We have no excuse. We've known about these things, but we live in a system that is incapable of facing or solving these problems, and now faces the coming together of all of them. And I think we are in for very rough times.
So, Professor Wolff, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. We're going to have you on to talk about the jobs, the situation with jobs. We're also going to have you on to talk about this sort of system of rent crises, this cascading potential for not just among people who are living in the country, but also business owners who own these buildings defaulting, and then this sort of cascades up with the landlords. And then you have their creditors, and it's going to be this whole thing. So I want to get into that. But I also, and I don't want to take too long on this, there's also this perspective on capitalism, where there are two main things having to do with the end of history. I'm going to bring this idea in. Marx, as far as I can tell, I've read some of his work, he foresaw that capitalism would destroy itself, basically. You would have this, not an end of history in any technical sense, but almost in this philosophical sense, a resolution of these deeper problems in capitalism through what we've come to call Marxism. On the other hand, in 1989, Francis Fukuyama published an essay a couple months before the Berlin Wall fell, a pretty notorious essay at this point, where he was saying that liberal democratic capitalism was going to preside over the end of history. Again, the Berlin Wall fell shortly after. Some saw this as a vindication of his idea, but then since we've seen in the decades following that event, that's not exactly the case. There are a lot of other types of government, a lot of other ideological systems that seem viable in this international context. But from what I can tell, capitalism, not pure capitalism, but capitalism undergirds every society around the world. Some sort of market economy, some private ownership of property, including the means of production, seems to be the basis of, again, every major political system in the world. I'm curious, what's your take on that? If there is going to be some resolution of capitalism, why haven't we seen it yet? How can we see it coming after, again, it seems like that's the one non-ideology, not an ideology, but the one economic system that's been a sort of clear and constant, not success, but again, a clear and constant presence around the world.
Well, I think you make a number of important points. I agree with you 100%. Capitalism has become the global system. It wasn't all that way always through history. It's important to remember. Slavery was an economic system that existed for centuries. Feudalism was an economic system that existed pretty much globally for centuries. Capitalism replaced those systems, sometimes by a direct confrontation, like in the American Civil War, sometimes through revolutions, sometimes just in the passing away of a system from its own internal conflicts, number one. So I think you're right about capitalism, but the fact that every place is capitalism is not an argument that it doesn't disappear, because it was true of slavery, it was true of feudalism, it was true of ancient tribal economies, and so on. I think what Marx was doing, and it was no great achievement, Marx was reminding people not that there's something peculiar about capitalism, that it should kind of break apart on its own internal difficulties, but the opposite, that it was, in fact, like all those other systems, that there was, in fact, no reason for people to imagine that this latest system would last forever when none of the previous economic systems the human race has known achieved such a thing. Capitalism exists because the previous system, at least in Europe, feudalism, dissolved, partly through its own contradictions, partly by the American and French revolutions. Remember, the United States did a war of independence against a feudal king, George III. That's what we're celebrating in the next couple of days. We broke away, and we didn't just break away from England to set up our own feudal kingdom. Not at all. We said we don't want feudalism. We do not want lords. We do not want serfs. And we do not want kings. And we abolished all of that for a new system, which we now call capitalism. And I think all Marx was saying, with a kind of tongue-in-cheek, was those of you, and that includes Mr. Fukuyama, as you mentioned, those of you who imagine that the system you're now in, where you are hopefully comfortable, or at least part of what you think runs the society, don't be so cocksure that you aren't, in fact, scheduled for the same historical passage that has been the reality for every other economic system in the history of the world. Once you see that, and it's one of the lessons you get from Marx, although Marx is by far not the only one to point this out, once you understand that, then of course you're forced to ask the following question. Where in the historical passage of capitalism are we? Are we in its early phases? Was it just born? Or are we in kind of, I don't know, the mid-phase where it is evolving like every other system after it was born evolved? Or, and here comes the scary part, or are we at the end? Are we at that period of time when slavery disappeared, or feudalism disappeared, or ancient tribal economies disappeared, or little self-employed peasant systems disappeared? Are we at that point in capitalism in general, and in American capitalism in particular, where it just has accumulated too many unresolved, unattended to problems? You know, it's not so different, if I could just end with this, it's not so different from what happens, I think, to most of us personally. We kind of have to learn, hopefully when we're young, but if not then, we'll learn later, that you can't keep pretending that problems that are serious in your personal life can just be brushed away, or you can just go on and they'll take care of themselves. You do that, and they will come back to bite you in the rear end at the least appropriate time. And if you let too many of them go like that, you reach a point where you have a personal crisis. Well, I think something like that happens to economic systems, and I'm beginning to think, and this is the first time in my adult life, I'm beginning to think we may be at that point.
Fault lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault lines.
And we are back again. If you're listening, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Very glad to be joined by Professor Richard Wolff, having an interesting conversation. I want to turn slightly to the original topic we'd chosen, but briefly, Professor Wolff, I'd like to express my gratitude and gratification. Thank you for joining us. Great to have this conversation. Hopefully we can continue it. Always love these. Regardless, though.
Absolutely. Me too.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I know it's glad the feeling's mutual. What we brought you on to talk about was a combination of things. Again, this coming upwelling of a lot of potential damage that's going to be done in the American economy to people in America, potentially with cascading consequences around the world. That's a larger conversation. I'd rather have this slightly smaller one about the job situation. New jobs numbers are in. It seems like we're seeing some jobs coming back, but again, we're at 11.1% unemployment. That's a far cry from where we were just 3-4 months ago when things seemed to be going fairly steadily. On the other hand, as we brought up briefly in that last segment, there's also this upcoming rent crisis. Now, one of our producers had sent me a video of yours on Rising, where you're talking with folks on the show Rising. What you were saying on that show, this economic side, the business side of the rental crisis, where you have, again, very large corporations, large and small, who are renting outlets, renting from landlords. They're not going to be able to pay that rent. In fact, they aren't. They're going to have to, again, default. The landlords are going to have to default too. This is going to turn into a sort of cascading, collapsing system as far as I can tell. Can you tell us more about that? What do you think the government's going to try to do to push back against that? How do you see this sort of playing out?
Okay. Very, very important. My thanks and appreciation that you bring this up. Frankly, I was overwhelmed when I first encountered the statistic that almost half, I believe it was like 47, 48%, of commercial tenants, basically that's stores that have rented space in a building somewhere, stores that have rented space in a mall someplace, about almost half of them did not pay their rent either in April or in May or both of those months. These were statistics that were gathered in the second half of June, which is why they don't include the month of June. I don't know what the numbers are, but my guess is they'll be in the same neighborhood. Okay, this is a staggering fact. We know why the stores were closed. You couldn't go in there and shop. You couldn't open them for reasons of health. But even if the health hadn't been an issue, nobody was going out, so you couldn't have, that would have made no sense. So it's a cascade. Because the stores are not paying rent, the problem now becomes the problem of the landlord, who has all kinds of expenses that depend on, if he's going to pay for them, that he gets his rent. So if the landlord doesn't get the rent, the landlord has no income. If the landlord has no income, he turns around to the investors in the mall that he runs or to the banks that have lent him money to be a landlord, to own a building or a mall, and he tells the bank, I cannot repay the loan. I can't pay the interest. I can't pay the amortization. So now the banks are drawn into the catastrophe because their loans are becoming what they call bad loans or loans in default. Now, every one of those people, every one of those groups, the tenants, the landlords, and the banks, just to stop with them, they are now in crisis. They don't know what to do. Each of them is using the money they have to hire the most expensive lawyers they can find to go into court because they have leases. The tenants are obliged by contract to pay their rent, which they're not doing. The landlords are obliged by contract to pay back their loans, which they're not doing. Notice that the normal business of capitalism, signing contracts, living up to them, that's all breaking down. Now it's everybody on your own, the fight of all against all, and the one with the biggest pocketbook to hire the biggest, bestest lawyers with the biggest, best connections to the system, to the judges, etc., will win. And that's usually a game where the bigger and larger you are, the better the chances you have. That's the law of the jungle, if you pardon me. It's not the law of a functioning economic system. And I am very, very concerned that we're going to see unbelievable struggles as it becomes clear to the storekeepers that their survival is at stake. It becomes clear to the landlords, and it becomes clear to the bankers, because if you're back up against the wall that way, all kinds of things you would never have done in a normal capitalist system arrangement, you will now do because literally your survival is at stake. Will you remain an honest businessman or woman? I don't know. What desperation will lead you to do, none of us can foresee. But one thing is clear, we are in for a very rough battle. We're not talking about the next few weeks. We're talking about the next few years at the very least. And there's no guarantee that this will be resolved in a way that will be happy for millions of Americans.
Explain that for the moment. Step into that. So Marx often made this thing that basically the most industrious country would be the one where capitalism comes from. I think at the time he was assuming that was going to be Germany, but is it possible that that's just the United States at this moment? And with all of this stuff breaking down, especially from the standpoint of renters, I think it was 30% that people didn't pay their rent in June or something, or I believe it was June.
Right.
It's some obscene number. What does it look like materially? Like, so going into, let's say, August, September, October, where the government basically says, we're not going to get involved in all of you people who lose your homes. And like you said, the appalling number of 47% of commercial tenants. I mean, that is a catastrophe, right? I mean, not to mention the number of people who are going to go bust because they don't have the extra $600 that the government was giving anymore either. So all of this stuff just hits all at once. What does that look like? And have we seen something in our history that resembles that? I know people make allusions to the Great Depression, but is there anything else that, with all of the crises that are availing us, and then such incompetence in regards to the leadership and all of the trauma and chaos, have we ever seen this level of perfect storms before in the United States?
Well, the closest, and it's very important you pointed that out, the closest we have as a parallel to try to learn from is the Great Depression. And I want to stress that that's an important model to look at. If you've never read novels like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, you don't perhaps grasp what it was like. The Grapes of Wrath, just to use it as an example, is the story of a group of desperate, poor farmers, basically, and other kinds of small businessy types, who collapse in the Great Depression, who have to literally leave their home because they can't stay there. They can't pay the rent, and they've been evicted. The very thing that is now being contemplated in the courts of America, as literally tens of thousands of landlords have already filed the papers in the courts where they are to evict the tenants that are not paying rent and who have no prospect, by the way, of paying that rent anytime soon. Okay, if you read the Grapes of Wrath, they pile all their belongings in an ancient jalopy. They start traveling across the United States in desperate poverty, doing a little work along the way if they can find anybody who will pay them to do anything. They end up in California because they hope that something magical might happen for them, even though they start off, I believe, in Oklahoma and so on. But you're talking about a society in which there were huge numbers of homeless people, some on the move, some just living under a bridge. You have a society of desperate poverty because the people who weren't homeless were worried that they would become homeless. Yeah, you're talking about a society where a huge number of people are basically pushed to the edges. They are not really participants anymore in what we took for granted. You have a job, you get up in the morning, 5 days a week, you go to work. You may not be rich, but you can get your latte on the way to your job and maybe on the way back. You're now talking about a society here in the United States, which is going to be looking more and more like the societies we used to see on television programs, maybe National Geographic, societies in which there was a comfortable downtown in a few big cities, and then a vast mass of desperate poverty virtually everywhere else. That vision of something foreign, that's coming home here, because the resolution to these problems, and maybe this is the most important thing for you to think about, your audience. Resolution to these problems, really, unless you are willing to change the distribution of wealth and income, to take from those who are the richest in order to sustain the life of the mass of your people, if you're not willing to do that, then you are looking at a situation that is going to, as I said before, make us have very difficult times in the years ahead.
Professor Wolff, that is both disheartening and apparently true. I see all this stuff coming too, and very glad to have you bringing some light to aspects of this I'm not too aware of. One brief note on the Dust Bowl situation, the background for the Grapes of Wrath. I just want to point out that was an ecological catastrophe that coincided with the Great Depression, but this also followed years of mistreatment of the prairies. So just throwing in the ecological side there, a lot of people know that.
Absolutely right. I should have had that in there. They had destroyed the land because they didn't understand that you can't keep plowing without making it a desert because of the rainfall and the thin crust of the earth at that point. Absolutely, good point. That's part of what creates catastrophes is when these different problems not attended to come in on you at the same time.
And Professor, thank you for backing me up there. Professor Wolff, one last quick comment. We only have 30 seconds, maybe a minute left. I just want to ask you've laid out broadly a wide array of cultural, governmental, economic problems. We're talking about these large conversations about capitalism, the fate of capitalism. I want to bring it back home. You're not a self-help expert, at least as far as I can tell, although you're definitely giving out some good advice. But for the average person, for people who are worried about this stuff impacting them, worrying what choices they should be making, in the last few moments before we go into our break over the weekend here, do you have any advice to give to those people in terms of what they should be doing?
Yes. Don't take any chances. We are not in a normal period. If you were thinking about taking out a loan, don't do it. If you were thinking about making a risky investment of any kind, don't do it. Yeah, you may miss out on a little bit of a hiccup going up with all the money that the Federal Reserve is pumping in. But in the longer run, you need to control and preserve what resources you have, because in all likelihood, you're going to need every last penny.
That is great. That is, that's stark honesty. That's what we want to bring you here. Professor Wolff, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, and thank you for having programs willing to deal with these realities.
we're really glad to have great guests like you who can help us to shed some light on them. For everybody who's been listening, you've been listening to the voice of Professor Richard D. Wolff, who is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, also the host of Economic Update with Richard D. Wolff that airs on Democracy at Work on YouTube. You can follow Professor Wolff on Twitter, Prof. Wolff, PROFWOLFF. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. One quick last programming note before we close out the weekend going into July 4th. We're not going to be around tomorrow. So Friday, tomorrow, we're off the air. We're done. We'll see you on the other side of the weekend. Happy Independence Day, coming back on Monday. Signing off, Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us. Professor Wolff, one of my favorite people, hands down. I've said it once, but said it again. One of my favorite people. So this was Fault Lines, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. I gotta be honest, my schedule, I'm still having difficulty adjusting to the schedule. Because it's prep time, right? So typically we had X amount of time for prep going into the show. So now prep goes kind of after, which makes me end up doing it early in the morning, which leads into the show. It's weird, but I'm getting better at it. Nevertheless, this show has gone exceptionally well, considering all of this was done on the fly, all of this was done in separate locations, and the show basically came together in that way. And so shout out to Shane, shout out to producer Raheem, not to mention the people in the background that make this work, the engineers. Bilal Salman. Oh, thank you, man. I appreciate it. Thank you, Bilal. And urgent, Ghislaine Maxwell has been arrested. Xavier Foster. Yeah, I got to do that story next, right? That has to come up next, because that was always mind-blowing to me. They say we found her in France. It was like, if you found her in France, why isn't that woman behind bars? I mean, think about it for the moment. We've called Epstein the apex pervert, so much so that he was an international pedophile. And all of the connections, nobody is entirely clear on how he was making his cash, how he was making his money, whether or not it was blackmail operations, either from the CIA or from the Israeli security. Everybody was kind of unclear on what this guy was, how he got his cash. The only thing they were clear on, that he was messing with little girls. And Ghislaine Maxwell was the key to that, the glue to that, by multiple witnesses, as his procurer, the madam that procured children for Epstein. So this is where we are. Now the catch becomes, if you're locking up her and you're locking up Epstein, or at the very least you tried to lock up Epstein, does she disappear? Does she vanish in our prison systems in the same way that Epstein did? And how do you explain that if two people who are involved in something like this, who a lot of people around the United States and the world are saying, shut up. They don't want her to talk, just like they didn't want Epstein to talk. And I got to be honest, a lot of people, when Epstein got in prison, I was like, God, he's never going to see trial. Now, I didn't say that because I was this kind of magnificent genius of sorts. I said that because I thought Epstein had a lot of connections. A lot of those people didn't want Epstein to talk. And beyond those people not wanting Epstein to talk, Epstein, in the situation to which he finds himself, was basically nearly infinite resources, at the very least from what a human being may want. Infinite connections in regards to security aspects and security services around the world. And now he's in prison. How do you live with that? I would imagine there's some people that can live with it a little bit better than others. But either way you look at it, if you are master of your domain and then all of a sudden you're subjected to the whims of an international or United States body of laws that are going to prosecute you, and your idea that you're going to end up in a prison cell or you're going to end up in jail may be too much for a person to bear, especially coming away from a situation where they were almost the exact opposite. I mean, this guy had royalty coming to his house. I think royalty, look, I don't believe in magical thinking. And one of the biggest, you could say, myths, or you could say scams that was pulled on the American public are a body of laws that try to tell you that you are better than this other person who is also a human being who you try to consider to be 3/5. It's like a magical spell. And on top of that, that you're somehow better than that person. Well, in Europe, you have this kind of similar magical thoughts of this person being bestowed to the office by God, royalty. This person, God appointed this person to this particular position. That's a little self-serving, right? God didn't appoint anybody. But if you can convince people of such, have at it. Well, in this case, Andrew may be outside of our jurisdiction in regards to outreach. But if Andrew was somebody who was printing newspapers, who the United States didn't necessarily like, I bet we'd get our hands on them then. Either way, Josephine Maxwell, apprehend it. Like, share, and of course,